Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Netheric Horror. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. This story is more unsettling than outright scary. Even now, years later, I'm not completely sure what to make of it. I've gone over the memories countless times trying to find logical explanations, but there are certain moments that still leave me with more questions than answers. It all started during my first semester of college, a period that was already emotionally difficult for my family. My grandmother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. The news came as a shock to everyone, even though she had been dealing with health problems for some time. Doctors gave her an estimate that felt impossible to hear. They believed she had only 2 months left to live. My grandparents had always been a huge part of my life. They were the kind of people who opened their home to everyone and never hesitated to help family when they were needed. When my grandmother received her diagnosis, I made the decision to move in with them so I could help take care of her. At the time, I was trying to balance college classes with family responsibilities. Looking back, it was one of the most exhausting periods of my life, both physically and emotionally. Cancer changes everything inside a household. Daily routines disappear. Normal conversations become centered around treatments, medications, appointments, and trying to make the most of the time that remains. The doctors had predicted 2 months. My grandmother lived for 9. Those extra months felt like a gift, even though they were incredibly difficult. There were good days when she laughed, told stories, and seemed almost like her old self. Then there were bad days when the reality of her illness became impossible to ignore. Throughout those 9 months, I spent countless hours in that house. Every hallway, every room, every creaking floorboard became familiar. The house itself wasn't particularly old or creepy. It was simply a normal family home filled with decades of memories. Eventually, though, the cancer won. My grandmother passed away peacefully, surrounded by people who loved her. Her death hit all of us hard. For weeks afterward, the house felt different. It wasn't just sadness. It was the strange emptiness that comes when someone who was such a major part of daily life is suddenly gone. Every room reminded me of her. The chair where she used to sit, the kitchen where she cooked, the hallway where she slowly walked during the last months of her illness. Even though I knew she was gone, my mind kept expecting to see her around every corner. At first, I assumed that was all it was. Grief, memory, the brain adjusting to loss. But then things started happening that I still struggle to explain. A few weeks after her death, I was alone in the house one afternoon. My grandfather was out running errands, and I was sitting in the computer room working on a college assignment. The house was completely quiet. As I stared at the screen, I suddenly had the overwhelming feeling that someone was behind me. Most people have experienced that sensation at some point. You become aware of another presence without hearing a sound. Usually, when you turn around, nobody is there. This felt different. The feeling was so strong that I instinctively looked over my shoulder. For a brief moment, I could have sworn someone was sitting on the bed behind me. Not just someone. My grandmother. The image vanished almost immediately. It wasn't like a horror movie apparition. There were no glowing lights or dramatic effects. It was more like catching a glimpse of someone you expect to see. only to realize they shouldn't be there. The moment lasted less than a second. Still, it left me frozen. I sat there staring at the empty bed. The room was silent. Nothing moved. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination. After all, I'd spent months caring for her. I was grieving. My mind was probably filling in familiar patterns. That explanation made sense. At least it did, until similar things kept happening. Sometimes I would walk through the hallway and see what looked like a person turning a corner ahead of me. When I looked again, nobody was there. Other times, I would briefly catch sight of a familiar figure moving through the house. Every time it happened, the figure resembled my grandmother. Oddly enough, none of these experiences frightened me. They startled me, certainly. They caught me off guard. But fear was never my first reaction. Instead, the experiences felt strangely comforting. If anything, I would think, oh, it's her. Then the feeling would pass, and I would continue with whatever I had been doing. Months went by. The strange sightings became less frequent, although I never completely forgot them. Then something happened that was much harder to explain away. One evening, I was at my grandparents' house with a girl I had been dating at the time. We were hanging out casually, talking and spending time together. It was completely normal. There was nothing unusual about the evening. At some point, I needed to grab something from the garage. The garage was connected to a small laundry room, which itself connected to the rest of the house. It was a familiar layout that I had walked through hundreds of times. I stepped into the garage, found what I was looking for, and came back toward the laundry room. My girlfriend was waiting for me there. When I walked in, we greeted each other and shared a quick hug. The entire moment felt completely ordinary. Then we both heard it. At first, it sounded like scratching, a rapid clicking noise against the floor. Click, 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 click. The sound came from somewhere deeper inside the house. We both stopped talking. The noise continued. It sounded exactly like a dog running across tile flooring. Anyone who has owned a dog knows the sound immediately. The nails strike the hard floor in a rapid rhythm that is impossible to mistake. Click, 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 click. The sound moved quickly. It wasn't stationary. Something seemed to be running through the house. My girlfriend and I pulled apart and listened. Neither of us said a word. The sound grew louder, closer, faster. It was heading directly toward us. I remember looking at her face and seeing the same confusion I felt. We both expected a dog to come around the corner. The problem was that there wasn't supposed to be a dog in the house. Not a single one. The clicking grew louder still. At that point, we could almost track its movement room by room. Whatever was making the noise was running straight toward the laundry room. My heart started pounding. The sounds were unmistakable. They were exactly what a medium-sized dog would sound like running across tile. Then we saw it. Something rounded the corner. For a split second, it appeared exactly like a dog, not a shadow, not a vague shape. A dog. It moved quickly and naturally. Without slowing down, it ran directly between our legs. Both of us jumped. I remember feeling movement pass through the narrow space between us. Then, without hesitation, the dog continued toward the door leading into the garage. There was just one problem. The door was closed, completely closed. The dog never stopped. It ran straight through it, not into it, not around it, through it, and then it was gone. The house fell silent. Instantly. No scratching, no footsteps, nothing. Just complete silence. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared at each other. The look on her face mirrored exactly what I was feeling. Disbelief, confusion, shock. Eventually, she broke the silence. "Did you see that?" I nodded. "Yeah, That was all either of us could manage. We opened the door to the garage. Nothing was there. No dog, no animal, no explanation. The garage was empty. We checked anyway. Every corner, every possible hiding place. Nothing. I wish I could say we stayed and investigated further, but we didn't. Instead, we did what most people probably would have done. We left. Immediately. The entire drive away from the house was filled with nervous conversation as we tried to make sense of what had happened. Maybe we had both misunderstood what we saw. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe it was some strange combination of shadows and sounds. The problem was that neither of us could come up with a believable answer. We had both heard the footsteps. We had both watched something run around the corner. We had both seen it pass between us, and we had both watched it disappear through a closed door. The strangest part came later. After thinking about the incident for days, I mentioned it to family members. As we talked about what the dog had looked like, someone brought up an old photo album. Inside were pictures taken years before I could remember much of anything. There, in several photographs, was a dog my grandparents had owned long ago. The dog had died when I was around 2 years old. I had no real memory of it, at least none that I was aware of. Yet the animal in those photographs looked remarkably similar to what both my girlfriend and I had seen. The color, the size, the build, everything matched. That realization sent chills down my spine in a way the original encounter hadn't. Seeing something strange is one thing. Discovering that it resembles a dog that died years earlier is another. To this day, I don't claim to know exactly what happened. Maybe grief affected me more than I realized. Maybe there are psychological explanations for some of the experiences involving my grandmother. The human brain is incredibly complicated, especially during periods of loss and emotional stress. But the dog is harder for me to explain. I wasn't alone. Someone else experienced it with me. We both heard it. We both saw it. Neither of us had any reason to invent the story. Years have passed since those events, and I still think about them occasionally. The memories don't terrify me. They never have. Instead, they leave me with a strange feeling, somewhere between curiosity and wonder. If what I saw after my grandmother's death was simply grief, then it was grief unlike anything I had ever experienced before. And if what ran through that laundry room was merely my imagination, then somehow my imagination managed to appear to two people at exactly the same time. Maybe there is a perfectly rational explanation waiting to be discovered. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that in a quiet house, filled with family memories, I occasionally saw my grandmother after she was gone. And one night, a dog that had been dead for years came running through the house, passed directly between two witnesses, and vanished through a closed door. I've never forgotten either experience. I've rewritten and expanded the story in smooth, natural English while keeping it close to the original events and suitable for a USA, UK, and Canada audience. One of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life happened about a year after my uncle died. Even now, I still don't know what to make of it. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation, but every possibility seems to leave unanswered questions. My uncle passed away from brain cancer when I was still fairly young. I wasn't even a teenager yet, but I was old enough to understand that something terrible was happening to him. I didn't fully grasp the medical details, but I could see the effect the illness was having on everyone around him, especially my mother. My mom and my uncle had always been close. Growing up, I heard plenty of stories about them, They had a strong sibling relationship and had shared countless memories together over the years. Family gatherings were always filled with laughter when they were around each other. Looking back, I can still remember seeing old photographs of them smiling together, joking around, and enjoying each other's company. That was why what happened during his illness was so difficult to watch. As the cancer progressed, it began affecting his brain. Along with the physical symptoms came confusion, mood swings, memory problems, and behavior that felt completely unlike the person everyone knew. My mother spent a great deal of time helping take care of him during that period. She drove him to appointments, helped him organize things around the house, and did everything she could to make his life easier. She never complained, even when it became emotionally exhausting. I often accompanied her when she visited him. At first, I didn't understand why she sometimes came home looking so drained. As a child, I simply assumed caring for a sick person was tiring. Over time, though, I began noticing things that made me uncomfortable. My uncle could be incredibly rude to her. The strange part was that it didn't seem intentional, at least not in the way people normally choose to be cruel. His personality seemed to be changing because of the disease. One minute, he would be completely normal. The next minute, he would become angry over something insignificant. I remember one particular afternoon when he became upset because some papers on a table weren't stacked exactly the way he wanted. He started criticizing my mother and calling her stupid. The reaction seemed completely disproportionate to what had happened. My mother remained calm. She tried explaining that she had only been trying to help. It didn't matter. He continued arguing. As a kid sitting quietly in the room, it felt awful to watch. I knew my mother was doing everything she could for him, yet here he was insulting her. Then there were moments that made even less sense. Sometimes he would suddenly accuse her of stealing things. Not valuables, random objects. Cups were a frequent example. He would insist that she had taken his cups, not one or two, all of them. He would become genuinely upset about it, convinced that she had somehow removed them from the house. Of course, she hadn't. Most of the time, the missing items would later be found somewhere unusual because he had misplaced them himself. But during those moments, no amount of reasoning could convince him otherwise. As a child, I didn't understand dementia, brain tumors, or neurological decline. All I knew was that someone who had once been kind to my mother was suddenly saying hurtful things to her. The situation left me confused. Part of me felt angry at him. Another part felt sorry for him, and most of all, I felt bad for my mom. She never fought back. Even when his words hurt her, she remained patient. She understood something I couldn't fully comprehend at that age. The disease was speaking as much as the man was. Still, it was heartbreaking. Sometimes we would leave his house after a difficult visit, and I could see the sadness on my mother's face. She rarely talked about it, but I knew those encounters affected her deeply. Watching someone you love slowly lose pieces of themselves is a unique kind of pain. Eventually, his condition worsened. The periods of confusion became more frequent. The moments of clarity became rarer. Then one day, he was gone. My uncle passed away, and while everyone expected grief, there was also a strange sense of relief mixed in with it. Not relief because he was gone, but relief because his suffering had finally ended. For my mother, the loss was complicated. She wasn't only mourning the man who died. In many ways, she had already spent months mourning the brother she remembered. The version of him she loved had been disappearing long before his body finally gave out. Life slowly moved forward. Weeks became months. Months became a year. The routines of daily life gradually returned. Although we still thought about him often, the intensity of the grief began to soften. Then something happened that neither my mother nor I have ever been able to explain. One evening, we returned home after being out for several hours. As soon as we walked through the door, we noticed something unusual. The answering machine was blinking. This was back when answering machines used miniature cassette tapes instead of digital recordings. The little red light flashed whenever new messages had been left. At first, there didn't seem to be anything strange about it. People left messages all the time. My mother walked over and pressed the playback button. The first message started. The moment we heard the voice, we froze. It was my uncle. For a second, neither of us reacted. Hearing the voice of someone who has been dead for a year creates a very strange feeling. It's not immediately frightening. It's shocking. Your brain struggles to process what it's hearing. As the message continued, we realized it was one we had heard before. Somehow, it had apparently been saved on the tape. We exchanged confused looks, but didn't think too much about it. Old answering machines occasionally did strange things. Maybe the tape had gotten stuck. Maybe it had replayed an old recording accidentally. There had to be some explanation. Then the second message began. This one was different. Neither of us had ever heard it before. The voice was unmistakably my uncle's. Even after all those years, I can still remember the way the room felt as we listened. The message wasn't long. In fact, it was surprisingly short. But every word seemed to hit with incredible weight. He was apologizing, not generally, not vaguely. Specifically apologizing to my mother. I remember one sentence more clearly than anything else. I shouldn't have said that earlier. The words sent chills through me. I looked at my mom. She looked completely stunned. Neither of us spoke. We simply listened. The message sounded like it had been recorded after one of those difficult visits, after one of the arguments, after one of the times when he had lashed out because of his illness. The tone of his voice sounded calmer than usual, clearer, almost like the uncle we remembered before the cancer changed him. When the message ended, the room felt impossibly quiet. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The machine clicked softly as the tape stopped spinning. I remember looking at my mother and seeing tears in her eyes. Not because she was scared, because she had just heard her brother's voice again. A voice she hadn't heard in over a year. And that voice was apologizing. We replayed the message, then replayed it again. Each time we listened carefully. Neither of us could figure out how it had appeared. If it had always been on the tape, why had we never heard it before? If it was an old recording, why did it suddenly play now? The entire thing felt impossible. Over the following days, I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I started thinking about dates. Maybe there was some connection. Maybe it had appeared on the anniversary of his death. Maybe it matched the date of a particular visit. Maybe there was some technical issue with the machine itself. I examined every possibility I could think of. Nothing fit perfectly. The logical explanation was that the message had somehow existed on the tape all along. Old answering machines weren't exactly reliable technology. Tapes could rewind incorrectly. Messages could overlap. Mechanical failures happened. Yet even that explanation left questions. Why had we never heard it before? Why did it appear exactly when it did? And why was it specifically an apology? Of all possible messages, it happened to be one that carried enormous emotional significance. My mother rarely spoke about the incident afterward. Whenever it came up, she would simply shake her head and say she didn't know what to think. Part of her believed there had to be a technical explanation. Another part wasn't so sure. Personally, I still don't know. I don't claim it was supernatural. I don't claim it wasn't. All I know is what happened. A year after my uncle died, my mother and I came home to find new messages on an old answering machine. The first was familiar, the second wasn't. And in that second message, the voice of a man who had spent his final months battling brain cancer apologized for things he had said while the disease was taking pieces of him away. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was technology behaving strangely. Or maybe, for one brief moment, my mother got something she never had the chance to receive while he was alive, a clear, sincere apology from the brother she remembered before the illness changed him. Whatever the explanation may be, it remains one of the most chilling and emotionally powerful moments I've ever experienced. Years later, I still remember standing in that room, listening to a voice from the past, wondering how a message that should have been impossible had somehow found its way back to us. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I got sick and had to stay home from school for a day. It wasn't anything serious, just one of those illnesses that left you feeling miserable enough to stay in bed, but not sick enough to need constant attention. Unfortunately, both of my parents had to work and couldn't get the day off. Before leaving that morning, they went through all the usual safety rules with me. Looking back, I can still remember the conversation, almost word for word. Stay inside the house. Don't answer the door. Don't talk to strangers. Call us if anything happens. At the time, these instructions felt routine. I'd heard them countless times before. I was old enough to be left alone for a few hours and understood the basic rules of staying safe. Once my parents left, the house became quiet. It was an old Victorian sandstone house that sat on a fairly busy main road. Across the street was a row of small shops, which meant there was always a steady flow of people walking past the front of the house throughout the day. The front room where I was sitting had a large bay window that looked directly out onto the street. Normally, I liked sitting there because it let in plenty of natural light. On that particular day, though, being home alone made me feel unusually exposed. I settled onto the couch and turned on the television, hoping to pass the time until my parents got home. For a while, everything felt normal. Cars drove by outside. People walked along the sidewalk carrying shopping bags. The sounds of traffic drifted through the windows. Nothing seemed unusual. After a while, however, I started feeling uncomfortable with how visible I was from the street. Every time someone walked past, it felt like they could see directly into the room. It was probably just the result of being home alone. But the feeling bothered me enough that I decided to partially close the curtains. I stood up and pulled them together just enough to block some of the view while still allowing light into the room. As I did, I happened to notice a man walking along the sidewalk. At first glance, there was nothing particularly alarming about him. He appeared to be somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s. He had a beard, wore glasses, and had on a green knitted sweater. Even now, decades later, I can picture him clearly. There was something about him that immediately caught my attention. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way he moved. Maybe it was the way he glanced toward the houses. Maybe it was simply a feeling. Whatever it was, something seemed slightly off. Not enough to genuinely scare me. Not enough to make me panic. Just enough to make me watch him until he disappeared from view. A few minutes later, I forgot about him and returned my attention to the television. About 10 minutes passed. Then I saw him again. The same man. the same green sweater, the same beard and glasses. What struck me as odd was that he appeared to be walking in the exact same direction as before. At first, my brain struggled to process it. Then I realized he must have somehow looped around the block and come back. That explanation seemed reasonable. Still, it felt strange. I watched him disappear from view once more. This time, however, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about the situation made me uneasy. I tried focusing on the television, but I found myself glancing toward the window every few minutes. Another 10 minutes went by. Then he appeared again. The moment I saw him, a cold feeling settled in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. He wasn't simply passing by. He had now walked past the house multiple times, and this time he stopped. He stood at the edge of our driveway. For roughly 30 seconds, he remained there staring toward the house, toward the window, toward me, even through the partially closed curtains. I knew he was looking directly inside. I immediately crouched lower behind the couch. My heart began pounding. At that age, I didn't fully understand danger, but I understood enough to know that something wasn't right. The man remained standing there for several moments. Then he started walking toward the front door. I remember feeling completely frozen. The front of the house had large old storm doors that led into the entrance area. They required a key to unlock, which meant he couldn't simply walk inside. Still, watching him approach felt terrifying. He reached the front door and knocked. Once, twice, then several more times. The sound echoed through the house. I stayed completely silent. Every instinct told me not to answer. The knocking continued, then stopped. For a brief second, I hoped he had given up. Instead, he moved toward the front window. I watched through a gap in the curtains as he peered inside. He started tapping on the glass, then banging harder. His mouth was moving as if he was speaking to me. I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying through the window. At the time, I wondered if he was asking for help or directions. But something about his behavior felt wrong. Normal people don't repeatedly circle a house before approaching it. Normal people don't stare into windows looking for children who are home alone. Every part of me felt that this was someone I needed to avoid. I stayed hidden. Then something happened that scared me more than anything else. I watched his expression change. Suddenly, he looked as though he had realized something. His eyes shifted away from the front window. He glanced toward the side of the house, toward the backyard, toward the back entrance. My stomach dropped. The back door. At that moment, I remembered something that hadn't crossed my mind all day. My parents rarely locked the back door. We had a dog who came and went throughout the day, and because of that, the door was often left unlocked. The realization hit me like a bolt of electricity. If that man went around the back of the house, he could potentially walk straight inside. I didn't wait another second. I sprinted from the front room. The television continued playing behind me as I raced through the hallway. Every second felt critical. I ran into the kitchen and headed straight for the back door. Sure enough, it was unlocked. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the key. I shoved it into the lock and turned it. The deadbolt clicked into place. I barely had time to step back. Within seconds, the handle began turning. The sound nearly stopped my heart. Someone was trying to open the door. The man had gone directly to the back entrance. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't knocked first. He had simply tried the handle. The realization terrified me. If I had waited even 10 seconds longer, he might have walked straight into the house. The handle rattled again. Then came the banging, heavy, aggressive. The door shook with each impact. I backed away until I hit the opposite wall. My entire body was trembling. I remember feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. The house suddenly seemed enormous and empty. There was nobody there to help me, nobody to protect me. Nobody even knew what was happening. The banging continued. I could hear him moving around outside. At one point, he tried another window, then another. Every sound sent fresh waves of panic through me. I imagined him finding a way inside. I imagined him breaking a window. I imagined him forcing a door open. As a child, my imagination ran wild. I had no idea what he wanted. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe he wasn't. But nothing about his actions suggested innocent intentions. I eventually curled into a ball on the kitchen floor. I remember pressing my back against a cabinet and trying not to make any noise. Tears ran down my face. My heart felt like it might explode. Every creak of the house sounded terrifying. Every shadow seemed threatening. Minutes felt like hours. The banging would stop for a while, then start again somewhere else. It seemed as though he was checking every possible way into the house. The experience felt endless. In reality, it was probably around 30 minutes. But to a frightened child sitting alone on a kitchen floor, it felt like an entire day. Then eventually, the noises stopped, completely. I remained where I was. I didn't move. I didn't dare look outside. For all I knew, he could still be there waiting. Several more minutes passed before I finally gathered enough courage to peek through a window. The driveway was empty. The street looked normal again. People continued walking past. Cars drove by. The man was gone, yet the fear remained. I spent the rest of the afternoon jumping at every sound, every knock, every passing car, every creak of the old house. I couldn't relax until my parents finally came home. The moment I heard their car pull into the driveway, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I ran to the door before they even reached it. When I told them what had happened, they immediately took it seriously. Looking back as an adult, I realized just how frightening the situation really was. At the time, I only knew that I had been scared. Now I understand how close things may have come to being much worse. Maybe there was some innocent explanation. Maybe the man was confused. Maybe he thought nobody was home. Maybe he had the wrong address. But none of those explanations account for everything. They don't explain repeatedly walking past the house. They don't explain staring into the windows. They don't explain trying the back door handle. And they certainly don't explain spending half an hour attempting to gain access to different parts of the property. Even now, years later, I occasionally think about that day. The memory remains incredibly vivid. I can still picture the green knitted sweater. I can still see the beard and glasses. I can still hear the rattling of the back door handle, only seconds after I locked it. More than anything, I remember the feeling. The realization that I was completely alone. The fear that someone was trying to get inside. And the knowledge that if I hadn't suddenly remembered the back door was unlocked, things could have turned out very differently. It's impossible to know what that man's intentions were. Maybe he was dangerous. Maybe he wasn't. But as a child home alone in an old house, watching a stranger repeatedly try to gain entry, it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. And to this day, whenever I think back on it, I still feel grateful that I remembered to lock that door when I did. While I was deployed in Kosovo, my team spent a significant amount of time conducting reconnaissance missions, many of which took place at night. Those missions often required us to move long distances through unfamiliar terrain while remaining completely undetected. The goal was usually straightforward. Gather information, confirm intelligence reports, and make it back to our extraction point before sunrise. Night operations have a strange effect on people. After spending enough time moving through forests, hills, abandoned buildings, and remote villages in complete darkness, your senses become sharper. You learn to notice the smallest sounds and movements. At the same time, your mind can start playing tricks on you. Shadows become shapes. Shapes become people. Every unusual noise feels significant. Because of that, most soldiers develop a healthy skepticism about strange experiences. We were trained to trust what we could verify and to question everything else. That's why what happened on one particular mission has stayed with me for years. Our team had been tasked with investigating reports that shipments of mortar rounds and landmines were being moved through a remote area. The mission itself wasn't especially dangerous compared to some others we'd carried out. Intelligence coverage was solid, the terrain was relatively open, and weather conditions were favorable. To make things even easier, the moon was nearly full. Anyone who has spent time conducting operations at night knows how valuable moonlight can be. Instead of stumbling through complete darkness, you can actually make out terrain features, trees, trails, and movement at a distance. Looking back now, it's almost funny that the night was so bright. Of course, it had to be for this story. Our reconnaissance teams normally consisted of 4 men. On this particular operation, however, we decided to bring along 3 newer soldiers. The mission provided a good opportunity for training without exposing them to excessive risk. Even with the additional personnel, we maintained our normal formation. I took rear security. A teammate I'll call L positioned himself directly in front of me. We had worked together countless times and functioned well as a pair. We trusted each other completely. When you're operating in small teams under difficult conditions, that trust becomes incredibly important. The mission started smoothly. We moved through roughly 10 kilometers of terrain, checking various locations and investigating potential routes that could be used to transport weapons. We found nothing. No shipments, no suspicious activity, no evidence supporting the intelligence reports. By that point, we needed to begin moving toward our extraction point. The pickup location was still several kilometers away and required crossing a large hill before moving through an area that sat near a small village. Not too close, just close enough to require caution. Before moving out, we regrouped and conducted the usual checks. Personnel count, equipment count, ammunition check, water, communications. Everything was in order. The team began moving. Because I was responsible for rear security, I was the last person to leave our position. Just as I prepared to move, I heard something, a noise. It came from the trees approximately 50 meters behind us. I immediately turned toward the sound. At the exact same moment, I noticed L doing the same thing. He had heard it too. The rest of the team continued moving forward. The newer soldiers in the middle of the formation hadn't noticed anything unusual. L and I exchanged a look. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. We both understood what needed to happen. The sound could have been anything. A deer, a stray dog, a branch moving in the wind. Still, we couldn't ignore it. As the team continued pulling away, Elle and I began moving using a 2-man bounding technique, alternating positions while maintaining observation of the area behind us. The noise came again. This time it sounded closer. I told Elle to continue forward and reconnect with the team while I stayed behind to observe. He nodded and moved out. I found a concealed position behind some cover and settled in. Then everything became quiet, completely quiet. For a few moments, I wondered if we'd overreacted. Then I heard movement again, a rustling sound, leaves shifting, branches moving. I focused my attention toward the source. About 15 meters ahead, I saw several trees move. Not swaying in the wind, moving, as if something had passed between them. Then everything stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural. I controlled my breathing and remained completely still. Minutes passed. I continued watching. Nothing emerged. Meanwhile, the rest of my team had begun circling around to investigate the area. Eventually, they established positions around the location I'd indicated. Once everyone was in place, we moved in. We searched carefully. Nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no broken branches. No sign that anyone or anything had been there. The result earned Elle and me the expected amount of teasing. The others joked that we'd gotten nervous after being left behind. We laughed along with them. At that point, it genuinely seemed like a false alarm. So we continued the mission. Several kilometers later, we reached an orchard that lay directly along our route. The moonlight illuminated the area almost perfectly. Rows of trees stretched across the landscape, evenly spaced and casting long shadows over the ground. The visibility was surprisingly good. As the team moved through the center of the orchard, I once again occupied the rear position. Everything felt normal. Then I heard the noise again. This time it was different. At first I couldn't identify it, then realization hit me. It sounded like laughter. Not adult laughter. A child's. Specifically, it sounded like a little girl giggling. The sound was faint, soft, almost playful. I stopped immediately. My first reaction wasn't fear, it was confusion. There shouldn't have been a child anywhere near us. We were moving through a rural area late at night, far from any houses. The idea made no sense. Ahead of me, Elle had already moved another 20 meters and stopped to wait for me. I repositioned near one of the trees and scanned the area. Nothing. No movement. No figures. No explanation. I crouched beside the tree and continued observing. That's when something strange happened. The tree itself caught my attention. At first, I noticed a pattern in the bark. The knots and grooves formed something that vaguely resembled a face. People often see faces in random patterns. It's a common psychological phenomenon. I assumed that's what I was experiencing. Still, I found myself staring. The longer I looked, the clearer the face appeared. Then the impossible happened. The face moved, not dramatically, not suddenly. It simply appeared. A little girl's face emerged from the bark. I remember every detail. Her expression was cheerful, her eyes bright. She looked directly at me, then she smiled. She raised a tiny hand and waved. A soft giggle followed. The sound wasn't threatening. There was no sense of malice, no hostility. If anything, the expression seemed friendly. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished back into the tree. Gone, as if she'd never been there. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My entire body felt frozen. Every piece of training, logic, and experience I possessed struggled to process what I'd just witnessed. There was no explanation, no category into which I could place the experience. I considered reporting it, then immediately dismissed the idea. There was absolutely no chance I was going to walk over to my team and announce that I'd just seen a little girl emerge from a tree. The reaction would have been merciless. So I did the only thing I could think of. I kept my mouth shut. Then I hurried forward and rejoined Elle. The rest of the mission passed without incident. We reached our extraction point and returned safely. Once back at base, I convinced myself that exhaustion had been responsible. Night operations were physically demanding. Lack of sleep affects perception. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe moonlight and shadows had combined in a strange way. Maybe my brain had created something that wasn't really there. The explanation wasn't satisfying, but it was better than the alternative. 2 weeks passed. Then another mission assignment came down. This time I was attached to a team of combat engineers responsible for locating and dealing with landmines. Meanwhile, my original team was scheduled to patrol the exact same area where the strange incident had occurred. Everyone thought it was hilarious, especially the guys who enjoyed reminding Elle and me about the mysterious noises we'd investigated. I was secretly relieved. I had no desire to return to that orchard. The engineer mission went smoothly. We located a recently established minefield near a village where children regularly traveled. The discovery was disturbing, but the engineers handled the situation professionally. They informed local residents and began safely destroying the mines. Watching them work reinforced my respect for combat engineers. It's difficult, dangerous work that often goes unnoticed. After the mission, I returned to base, feeling accomplished. I stopped by my commander, received a brief thank you for the assistance, and headed toward my barracks room. The building was quiet. None of my teammates had returned yet. I removed my boots and finally started relaxing. A few minutes later, the door burst open. The entire team came pouring inside. Everyone was laughing, everyone except Elle. He looked annoyed. One of the guys spotted me and immediately pointed. "Hey, Elle says he's never going back to your favorite spot again." The room erupted into laughter. Elle rolled his eyes and told everyone to shut up. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something had happened. A few days later, Elle and I found ourselves assigned to another mission together. We spent hours watching over a group of scouts conducting training exercises. Eventually, during a quiet moment, Elle looked over at me. "What did you see that night?" The question caught me completely off guard. I tried to play it off. "I don't know. Probably just my imagination." Elle remained silent for a few seconds. Then he said words I'll never forget. "I know you saw her." A chill ran through my body. I stared at him. He continued. "I saw her too." The world seemed to stop. Until that moment, I had never spoken about the experience. Not to Elle, not to anyone. I hadn't provided details. I hadn't hinted at anything. Nobody knew. Yet somehow he was describing the exact thing I'd witnessed. His voice became quieter. "Tell me I'm not crazy." For a moment, I couldn't answer. I felt completely numb. Finally, I shook my head. "You're not crazy." Then I asked the only question that mattered. "Where did you see her?" Elle looked away for a second, then answered, "Inside a tree." The words hit me harder than anything else that had happened. When I saw the little girl, Elle had been approximately 40 meters away. He couldn't have seen what I was looking at. He couldn't have observed my reaction. There was no opportunity for him to learn what I'd experienced. And yet, his description matched mine perfectly. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night in Kosovo. Maybe exhaustion played tricks on both of us. Maybe moonlight and shadows created identical illusions. Maybe there is a psychological explanation waiting to be discovered. Or maybe there isn't. All I know is this: 2 trained soldiers operating independently in the same orchard saw the same little girl inside a tree. Neither spoke about it, neither shared details, and weeks later, both described the exact same impossible thing. I've encountered danger, uncertainty, and countless strange situations throughout my military career. Yet somehow, the memory that still sends chills down my spine isn't an enemy encounter or a firefight. It's the image of a smiling little girl peeking from the bark of a tree, waving softly beneath a bright Kosovo moon, and disappearing as though she had never existed at all. When I was growing up, my family lived with my grandparents for a period of time. Their house was the kind of place that seemed completely normal during the day, but felt entirely different once you were alone. It wasn't haunted, as far as I know, and nothing particularly strange ever happened there on a regular basis. Still, like many older homes, it had certain rooms and objects that seemed capable of making your imagination work over time. For me, that object was a doll, not just any doll. It belonged to my aunt and stood in her bedroom like some silent guardian of nightmares. The doll was around 2 feet tall and dressed in a Victorian-style outfit. At some point before I was born, someone had converted it into a lamp. I have no idea why anyone would think turning a large Victorian doll into a light fixture was a good decorating decision. But apparently somebody did. The result was terrifying. The doll stood permanently on a nightstand beside my aunt's bed. It faced the bedroom door directly, which meant anyone entering the room was immediately greeted by its expressionless stare. Its eyes seemed to follow you. Its smile never changed. It had that unsettling look many old dolls have, where they appear almost human, but not quite human enough. Even as a kid, I hated being in the same room with it. What made the doll even worse was the way the lamp functioned. Most lamps have a switch. This one didn't. To turn it on, you had to physically interact with the doll. Specifically, you had to grab its cold plastic hand and raise and lower its arm. Only then would the light switch on. The idea of voluntarily touching that thing was enough to make my skin crawl. As a child, I avoided it whenever possible. Whenever I entered my aunt's room, I made a conscious effort not to look directly at it. The less attention I gave it, the better. At least that was my strategy. Then one afternoon, circumstances forced me into its territory. I was around 13 years old. The rest of the family was out, leaving me alone in the house. At some point, I decided I wanted a blanket. For reasons I can't remember, the blanket I wanted happened to be stored in my aunt's bedroom closet. The moment I realized where it was, I felt a wave of disappointment. Of all the closets in the house, it had to be that one. Still, I wanted the blanket badly enough to risk entering the room. I immediately began calculating how to minimize my exposure to the doll. Fortunately, 2 factors worked in my favor. First, it was the middle of the afternoon. Bright sunlight poured through the windows. I wouldn't need to turn on any lights. Second, the closet was located directly beside the bedroom entrance. That meant I wouldn't have to cross the room. I could enter, grab the blanket, and leave as quickly as possible. Simple. At least that was the plan. I approached the room carefully. Even standing in the hallway, I could feel my nerves kicking in. The doll was inside, waiting, facing the door, looking exactly where I would appear. Determined not to make eye contact, I stared directly at the floor as I entered. I refused to look up, not even for a second. The room remained silent. I could hear my own footsteps. I stepped inside and immediately turned toward the closet. Now my back faced the doll. That felt slightly safer. If I couldn't see it, maybe I wouldn't think about it. I reached for the closet door and pulled it open. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, several blankets sat folded on a lower shelf. Perfect. I bent down and reached toward them. Just a few more seconds and I'd be gone. Then something changed. At first, I couldn't identify what it was. The room felt different. Not dramatically, subtly, but definitely different. I froze, still crouched beside the closet. Something wasn't right. A strange sensation crept up my spine. The tiny hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood on end. Every instinct in my body became alert. The room seemed brighter, much brighter. I slowly glanced downward and noticed something that immediately sent a jolt of fear through me. Light. The room was illuminated, not by sunlight, by the lamp. My stomach dropped. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. The lamp was on, the doll lamp, the one that required someone to physically raise and lower its arm, the one I had specifically avoided touching, the one standing behind me. I remained completely motionless, every muscle in my body locked up. The silence in the room felt overwhelming. I could hear my heartbeat. I could hear my breathing. Beyond that, nothing. My mind desperately searched for explanations. Maybe someone had left it on. Maybe I simply hadn't noticed. Maybe. No, that wasn't possible. I knew the lamp had been off. I knew because I had checked before entering. The room had been lit only by sunlight. Now the lamp was glowing. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I suddenly became aware that my back was still facing the doll. The idea of turning around felt impossible. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt from the room, to sprint down the hallway and never look back. But another part of me needed to know. Something had happened. I had to see it. Slowly, I began standing up. My hands felt numb. My legs felt weak. The room seemed unusually quiet, as if every sound had been swallowed by the walls. I turned toward the doorway, and as I did, I finally lifted my head. The sight waiting for me has never left my memory. Even decades later, I can picture it perfectly. The doll stood exactly where it always stood. Its expression remained unchanged. Its eyes stared forward. Its eerie smile remained frozen on its face. But now its arm was raised. Not lowered, raised. And it wasn't simply raised into the air. It appeared to be pointing directly at me. For a moment, my entire body stopped functioning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. All I could do was stare. The image burned itself into my mind instantly. The illuminated room, the glowing lamp, the doll's cold smile, the raised hand aimed directly at me. I don't know how long I stood there. Probably only a second or two. It felt much longer. Then survival instinct finally took over. Every rational thought disappeared. I turned and ran. Not walked, not hurried, ran. I exploded out of that room as fast as my legs could carry me. The hallway blurred past. I didn't stop until I reached another part of the house. Even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Part of me expected to see the doll somehow standing behind me. Of course, it never did. Nothing followed me. Nothing happened afterward. The rest of the afternoon passed normally, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Eventually, family members returned home. I considered telling someone. Then I imagined how ridiculous it would sound. A lamp turned on. A doll's arm was raised. That's all. There was no proof, no evidence. Just a frightened 13-year-old convinced he'd witnessed something impossible. So I kept it to myself. Years passed. Then decades. And yet that image remains remarkably clear. I've forgotten countless details from my childhood. I've forgotten names, conversations, birthdays, and school assignments. But I have never forgotten that moment. Whenever I think about it, I can still see the room exactly as it was. The afternoon sunlight, the open closet, the sudden glow of the lamp, and the doll, standing motionless beside the bed, smiling its dead-eyed smile, with one plastic hand raised toward me. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Perhaps someone had accidentally left the lamp partially switched on. Maybe the arm mechanism was loose and moved on its own. Maybe there was some completely ordinary explanation I simply never discovered. As an adult, I can acknowledge those possibilities, but that doesn't change how it felt. Because at 13 years old, standing alone in a quiet house, It didn't feel ordinary. It felt like every childhood fear had suddenly become real. To this day, whenever I see old Victorian dolls, I instantly think of that room. I think of that lamp. And I remember the overwhelming terror of turning around and finding a doll pointing directly at me. Some memories fade with time. Others stay exactly where they are, waiting quietly in the back of your mind. This is one of those memories. And even now, after all these years, I still wish I had never looked. About 4 years ago, I experienced something that still bothers me whenever I think about it. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation, but even now, I can't fully make sense of what happened. The strange part isn't that I remember it so clearly. The strange part is that I remember the exact times involved. Normally, if you ask me what I did on a random day 4 years ago, I couldn't tell you. I probably wouldn't even remember what I had for dinner last week. But this particular morning has stayed with me because the entire experience revolved around clocks, timestamps, and time itself seeming to stop making sense. It happened on a day off from work. I had no obligations, no alarms to rush me out of bed, and nowhere I needed to be. Because of that, I slept in later than usual. When I finally woke up, the first thing I did was glance at the alarm clock sitting beside my bed. The display read 10:21 a.m. I remember seeing it clearly, not approximately. Not around 10:20, exactly 10:21. I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just another lazy morning. I rolled out of bed, stretched, and headed toward the bathroom. Like most people on a day off, I wasn't in any hurry. The bathroom was warm and comfortable compared to my bedroom, so I lingered there longer than necessary. I used the restroom, brushed my teeth, washed my face, and generally moved at the relaxed pace that only exists when you know you don't have to be anywhere. Several minutes passed. At least that's what it felt like. Eventually, I got dressed and headed back into my room. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and checked for messages. The time displayed on the screen was 10:25. At first, nothing seemed strange. Then I paused. Something about that bothered me. I mentally retraced what I'd just done. I'd gotten out of bed, walked to the bathroom, used the restroom, brushed my teeth, got dressed. Spent a while standing around doing absolutely nothing productive. Yet somehow only 4 minutes had passed. I stared at the screen. 10:25. That didn't seem right. Maybe I'd simply misread the clock when I woke up. That explanation made sense. People are groggy when they first wake up. Maybe I'd seen 10:21, but it had actually been 10:18 or 10:17. Maybe my brain hadn't fully switched on yet. To verify, I looked at my bedroom alarm clock. It also said 10:25, same time, same result. I shrugged and decided my memory must be wrong. Case closed. Or so I thought. I headed downstairs to start my morning. My routine was pretty typical. I turned on my computer. I switched on the television and put the news on in the background. I grabbed a glass of water. Then I started making breakfast. Nothing unusual happened during any of this, at least not immediately. I had some leftover rice from the previous night and decided to heat it in the microwave while cooking eggs. As I walked over to the microwave, I glanced at the digital clock above the buttons. The display read 10:25. I stopped. For a moment, I simply stared at it. 10:25. That couldn't be right. I immediately pulled my phone from my pocket. 10:25. The same time. My stomach tightened slightly. I looked around the kitchen, trying to mentally calculate everything I'd done since leaving my room. I'd walked downstairs, turned on the computer, turned on the television, gotten water, started breakfast, moved around the kitchen, There was absolutely no way all of that had happened in less than a minute. Yet according to every clock I could see, it had. The feeling wasn't fear. Not yet. Mostly confusion. I stood there trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe I'd somehow become distracted. Maybe time had passed differently than I realized. Maybe I was still sleepy. Still, the situation felt wrong. To test it, I decided to watch the microwave clock directly. I started counting seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3, 4. The plan was simple. If the microwave was malfunctioning, eventually it would reveal itself. I kept counting. The display remained 10:25. Then around 20 seconds into my count, it finally changed. 10:26. Exactly as it should have. The clock wasn't frozen. The microwave wasn't broken. Time appeared to be moving normally, at least while I was watching it. I remember feeling slightly relieved. Maybe I really had just lost track of time. Maybe nothing strange was happening. So I finished making breakfast. Eggs, rice. Nothing fancy. I carried the plate over to my computer desk, sat down, and prepared to enjoy a lazy morning. Then everything got much worse. The first thing I noticed was the clock displayed on my computer screen. 10:20. I frowned. That wasn't possible. I had literally just watched the microwave clock advance from 10:25 to 10:26. I immediately reached for my phone. 10:20. The same time. My pulse quickened. Now I wasn't confused anymore. I was genuinely disturbed. Somehow time had apparently gone backward. Not by a second or two. By 6 minutes. I sat there staring at both screens. Neither changed. Both insisted it was 10:20. I looked toward the television. The time displayed there matched. Everything agreed. According to every device in front of me, it was now earlier than it had been several minutes ago. That was the moment I realized something truly bizarre was happening. I opened a text document on my computer and started writing everything down. Every time, every observation, every clock. I wanted a record in case I later convinced myself I'd imagined it. The more notes I took, the stranger things became. At one point, I pulled up a clock application on my computer and simply watched the second hand move. While observing it directly, everything behaved perfectly normally. The seconds advanced. The minutes changed. Nothing appeared unusual. 10:20 became 10:21, 10:21 became 10:22, exactly as expected. But then I'd stop watching. I'd focus on something else for a few minutes. Maybe breakfast, maybe the news, maybe checking messages. Then I'd glance back. The time would no longer make sense. Sometimes it had barely advanced. Sometimes it appeared to have moved backward. At one point, both my computer and phone displayed 10:14. I remember staring at them in disbelief. How was that possible? Earlier they had shown 10:20. Before that, I'd seen 10:26. Now somehow it was 10:14. I checked internet clocks. Same thing. The bizarre behavior wasn't isolated to a single device. It appeared everywhere. Digital clocks, connected clocks, independent clocks. The results made no sense. For the next hour or so, maybe 90 minutes, my entire morning became an investigation. I wasn't doing anything productive anymore. I was obsessed. Every few minutes, I checked another clock. Every few minutes, reality seemed to contradict itself. The strangest pattern was this. Whenever I actively observed a clock, time behaved normally. The second hand moved smoothly. The numbers advanced correctly. Everything appeared consistent. But the moment I stopped paying attention for more than a couple of minutes, all bets were off. The next time I checked, the displayed time could be almost anything within that 10-minute range. 10:13, 10:18, 10:21, 10:25, back and forth, forward and backward. Like reality couldn't decide what time it actually was. I remember sitting at my desk trying to rationalize it. Could every device in my house somehow be malfunctioning simultaneously? Unlikely. Could there be some strange synchronization issue affecting everything? Maybe. But that still didn't explain why clocks seemed normal when watched directly. Could I be experiencing some bizarre perception issue? Sleep deprivation? A migraine? Some kind of neurological event? The possibility crossed my mind. Yet I felt completely normal otherwise. No dizziness, no headache, no confusion beyond the clocks themselves. Everything else seemed perfectly real. As the experience continued, I became increasingly uncomfortable. Not because I thought something supernatural was happening. Because I couldn't find a single explanation that fit all the facts. The more I analyzed it, the less sense it made. Time itself felt unreliable. And when something as fundamental as time becomes unreliable, it creates a surprisingly unsettling feeling. Every routine action depends on an assumption that clocks move forward in a predictable way. That morning, that assumption vanished. I remember repeatedly checking internet time servers because I trusted them more than household appliances. Even those seemed inconsistent. I refreshed pages, compared timestamps, checked multiple sources. Nothing helped. The discrepancy remained. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. There was no dramatic moment, no final anomaly, no clear transition. Eventually, I noticed that every clock agreed again. The times progressed normally. Minutes advanced exactly when they should. Nothing jumped backward, nothing froze. Everything simply returned to normal. I continued checking for another hour, waiting for the weirdness to return. It never did. The rest of the day passed completely normally. So did the next day, and the next. 4 years have passed since that morning. I've never experienced anything remotely similar again. No frozen clocks, no backward jumps, no strange discrepancies, nothing. Just one bizarre morning that lasted roughly 90 minutes and then disappeared forever. Over the years, I've revisited the memory countless times. I've researched clock synchronization issues, computer time errors, phone glitches, sleep-related confusion, false memories, neurological explanations. I found theories that explain parts of what happened, but none explain all of it. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary cause. Maybe several unrelated glitches happened simultaneously. Maybe I was somehow misperceiving the passage of time. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I woke up one morning at 10:21. A few minutes later, it was 10:25. Then it was 10:26. Then somehow it became 10:20. Then 10:14. Then 10:13. Then back into the 20s again. For roughly an hour and a half, every clock around me seemed to lose its mind. Then everything returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. And 4 years later, I still occasionally find myself staring at a clock and remembering the morning when time itself seemed to stop making sense. One of the most frightening experiences I had as a teenager happened during what should have been a completely ordinary drive home from high school. Even years later, I can still remember every detail with uncomfortable clarity. At the time, it felt like something out of a movie. Looking back as an adult, it feels even more disturbing because I now realize how badly the situation could have ended. It was a normal weekday afternoon. Classes had finished, and my friend and I were heading home. We had made that same drive countless times before. The roads were familiar, the traffic was typical, and neither of us expected anything unusual to happen. My friend was driving, and we were both doing what most teenagers do after school, talking about random things, complaining about classes, and looking forward to getting home. As we approached a major intersection, we came to a stop at a red light. There was nothing remarkable about it. Cars lined up in the various turn lanes. People waited patiently for the signal to change, and everything seemed completely routine. We were sitting in the left turn lane waiting for the arrow. When it finally changed to green, my friend accelerated. Maybe a little harder than necessary. His tires chirped against the pavement and peeled out slightly as we started moving through the intersection. It wasn't some dramatic street racing launch. It was just the kind of thing a teenage driver occasionally does without thinking. We laughed and continued through the turn. Then something happened that instantly changed the mood. A green pickup truck that had been sitting behind us suddenly accelerated. Hard. Within seconds, it pulled up beside us on the driver's side. I remember turning my head and seeing the driver. He was bald, large, and intimidating looking. The expression on his face immediately caught my attention. He looked furious. Not mildly annoyed, not irritated, genuinely enraged. His face was red, and he was shouting something through his closed window. At first, we couldn't hear anything because both vehicles had their windows rolled up, but we didn't need to hear him. The anger was obvious. He was screaming. His arms were moving. His mouth was wide open. Every part of his body language radiated hostility. My friend glanced over. I glanced over. Then we looked at each other. Neither of us had any idea what his problem was. Maybe he was angry about the quick acceleration. Maybe he thought my friend had cut him off. Maybe he was simply having a terrible day. Whatever the reason, this guy looked completely unhinged. Fortunately, we figured we'd be separating soon. That's usually how road rage incidents work. One driver gets angry, yells something, and eventually both vehicles go different directions. Unfortunately, that isn't what happened. A short distance later, we came to another red light. As we slowed to a stop, I looked into the side mirror. My stomach dropped. The green pickup was still there. Not only was it still there, but the driver deliberately pulled right up beside us again. This time, he positioned himself directly next to our car, close enough that there was no doubt he wanted our attention. The man immediately started gesturing. At first, he motioned for us to roll down our window. Neither of us wanted anything to do with that. We shook our heads and tried to ignore him. We weren't rude. We weren't making faces. We simply wanted the interaction to end. That seemed to make him even angrier. His expression darkened. Then he made a gesture I'll never forget. He formed his hand into the shape of a gun. Slowly, deliberately, he pointed it at us. Then he pointed it at his own head and pulled the imaginary trigger. My blood ran cold. The atmosphere inside our car changed instantly. What had previously felt like road rage suddenly felt much more serious. Neither of us laughed anymore. Neither of us spoke. We simply stared. Then things got worse. The man reached toward his glove compartment. At least that's what it looked like. I watched him lean over and move his hand downward. Immediately, my mind jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Maybe he was reaching for a weapon. Maybe he wasn't. But after the gesture he'd just made, neither of us wanted to find out. At that exact moment, the traffic light turned green. For a split second, my friend and I looked at each other. Neither of us needed to say anything. The decision was obvious. Leave now. My friend slammed the accelerator. The car surged forward. Both of us were yelling at that point, adrenaline flooding through our systems. I glanced backward. The pickup truck launched forward immediately. Its tires spun against the pavement as it accelerated after us. He wasn't letting it go. He was following us, aggressively. Within moments, he was directly behind us. Close, far too close. Every time my friend changed lanes, the truck changed lanes. Every turn we made, he made. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't a coincidence. We were being chased. The realization was terrifying. At that age, neither of us had ever experienced anything like it. The situation felt surreal. One minute, we were driving home from school. The next, a stranger who had just mimed shooting us was pursuing us through town. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear it. Every possibility ran through my mind. What if he really had a gun? What if he caught up to us? What if we got stuck at another red light? What if he forced us off the road? We desperately needed a plan. Then I thought about my neighborhood. I had grown up there. I knew every street, every shortcut, every dead end, every cul-de-sac. The man following us didn't. That gave us one advantage. I quickly explained my idea to my friend. If we could get into the neighborhood and create enough distance, we might be able to turn onto a smaller residential street before he noticed. Then we could hide. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one we had. We headed toward my neighborhood. The truck remained glued to our rear bumper. At times, it felt like he was only a few feet behind us. The entire drive was nerve-wracking. Every glance in the mirror showed the same thing. That green pickup. That angry driver. That relentless pursuit. As we approached the entrance to the neighborhood, I started giving directions. Go faster. Stay straight. Get ready to turn. The streets became more residential. Traffic became lighter. The truck was still there. Then our opportunity appeared. A subdivision entrance approached on the left. I immediately shouted for my friend to take it. Without hesitation, he turned sharply. The car leaned slightly as we entered the side street. For a second, I thought we'd lost control. Then we straightened out and accelerated again. We raced deeper into the neighborhood. Street after street flew past. I kept checking behind us. No truck, not yet. Still, we couldn't relax. He could appear at any second. We continued until we reached a busy-looking cul-de-sac, filled with parked cars and several houses. My friend pulled behind a vehicle sitting in a driveway. We stopped. The engine went quiet. Suddenly, the world felt eerily still. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. We simply sat there listening, waiting, watching. My chest felt tight. Every passing second seemed to stretch longer than normal. Eventually, we saw movement. The green pickup appeared. It drove past the entrance to the street where we were hiding. Slowly. Almost as if the driver was searching. For a terrifying moment, I thought he had spotted us. But he continued driving. Past the street, past the houses, past us. Then he disappeared. The relief that followed was overwhelming. Both of us exhaled at the same time. Neither of us had realized how tense we'd become until that moment. We sat there quietly for several minutes, just making sure he didn't return. Eventually, the shock started wearing off. The adrenaline faded slightly. The reality of what had happened settled in. We started talking again. At first, we laughed nervously. Not because anything was funny, because sometimes that's what people do after they're scared. You laugh simply because you're relieved to still be okay. Still, beneath the laughter was genuine fear. Neither of us knew what the man's intentions actually were. Maybe he was bluffing. Maybe he wasn't. Maybe the gesture meant nothing. Or maybe we had narrowly avoided something much worse. The uncertainty was what bothered us most. After discussing it, we decided to contact the police. We explained what had happened and eventually met with an officer. More than anything, we wanted to ensure it was safe to go home. The officer took the report seriously and helped reassure us. By that point, the truck was nowhere to be found. The driver had vanished, and thankfully, we never saw him again. No follow-up encounters, no second confrontation, nothing. Just one terrifying afternoon that began with a normal drive home from school and ended with us hiding in a cul-de-sac from a stranger who had threatened us and chased us across town. Years later, I still think about it occasionally. I wonder what would have happened if we'd rolled down the window. I wonder what was in the glove compartment. I wonder why he became so angry in the first place. Most of all, I'm grateful we trusted our instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. That afternoon, two high school kids found themselves being pursued by a man whose behavior became more threatening with every passing minute. Fortunately, we knew the area better than he did. Fortunately, we managed to lose him. And fortunately, the story ended with us safely talking to a police officer instead of becoming the subject of a very different kind of story. To this day, whenever I see a green pickup truck that resembles his, I still feel a small knot form in my stomach. Some memories never completely fade. That afternoon is definitely one of them. This isn't my story personally, but it was told to me by a former teacher many years ago, and the way she told it made it impossible to forget. She wasn't the type of person who constantly shared ghost stories or tried to convince people of paranormal experiences. In fact, she was usually very practical and down to earth. That's one of the reasons the story stuck with me. She insisted it was completely true and claimed every detail had happened exactly as she remembered it. Even now, years after hearing it, I still think about it from time to time. According to her, the story began when she was a young child. She shared a bedroom with her younger sister in their family home. Like many siblings, they spent most nights talking before falling asleep, whispering about school, friends, and whatever happened to be on their minds. The bedroom itself wasn't particularly unusual. It was an ordinary room with two beds and a doorway that opened into a hallway. During the day, it looked completely normal. At night, however, the hallway outside became dark once the lights were turned off. One evening, the sisters had gone to bed as usual. The house was quiet. Their parents were asleep. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At some point during the night, my teacher was lying awake in bed when her younger sister suddenly spoke. Her voice sounded strange. Not frightened exactly, more confused. Her sister quietly said, "Look at the door." At first, she didn't understand why. She turned her head toward her sister. "What?" Her sister repeated herself. "Look at the door." Something in her tone immediately made her uneasy. Slowly, she turned toward the doorway. The moment she looked, she froze. Standing in the doorway was the silhouette of a man. Not a vague shape, not a shadow cast by furniture. A figure, tall, motionless, completely black against the darkness of the hallway. The outline was unmistakably human. She could clearly make out the shape of a head, shoulders, torso, and legs. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't speaking. It was simply standing there, watching. For a few terrifying seconds, neither sister said a word. They simply stared. The room suddenly felt much colder. My teacher later said that what frightened her most wasn't the figure itself. It was how still it was. A real person shifts their weight, breathes, moves slightly. This figure did none of those things. It just stood there, silent, watching. Fortunately, there was a light switch mounted on the wall right beside her bed. Without taking her eyes off the doorway, she reached toward the switch. Her hand trembled as she found it. Then she flipped it on. The room instantly flooded with light. The doorway was empty, completely empty. No man, no shadow, nothing. The hallway beyond looked exactly as it always did. The sisters sat frozen for a moment. Their hearts were pounding. Neither understood what they had just seen. Finally, they began calling for their father. "Dad! "Dad!" A few moments later, they heard footsteps approaching. Their father appeared in the doorway, a real person this time, concerned and slightly annoyed at being awakened in the middle of the night. He stepped into the room and asked what was wrong. The girls immediately began explaining. They told him they had seen someone standing in the doorway, a man, tall, watching them. Their father listened patiently. Then he gave the explanation most parents would give. "It's probably just your eyes playing tricks on you." He explained that darkness can make ordinary objects appear strange. People sometimes imagine things when they're tired. Shadows can look like people. The girls weren't entirely convinced, but they eventually accepted his explanation. After all, what else could they do? The lights were on. The doorway was empty. Nothing seemed wrong. Eventually, everyone returned to bed. The following morning, my teacher headed downstairs for breakfast. The events of the previous night were still fresh in her mind. Part of her expected to laugh about it. Part of her still felt unsettled. As she entered the kitchen, she immediately noticed something unusual. Her father was already awake. He was sitting alone at the kitchen table, just staring, not reading the newspaper, not drinking coffee, simply staring into space. His expression looked troubled. My teacher approached him and asked what was wrong. Her father didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her for several seconds. Then he asked a question, a very specific question. "Was the man you saw tall?" The room suddenly felt different. My teacher's stomach dropped. According to her, she had never described the figure's height to him. Neither she nor her sister had mentioned that detail during the conversation the previous night. Yet somehow he knew. She slowly answered yes. The figure had been tall, very tall. Her father's face reportedly became pale. Then he admitted something that shocked her. He had seen the same figure. Not that night, several times before, for years. According to him, he occasionally saw the silhouette standing in various parts of the house, usually in doorways, sometimes in hallways, always the same figure. Always tall, always motionless. And every time he turned on a light, it vanished. Hearing that terrified her. The comforting explanation from the previous night suddenly disappeared. If her father had seen the same thing, then how could it simply be her imagination? The conversation ended there, at least for the moment. But the experience didn't. Over the following years, strange sightings continued. Not constantly, not every day, not even every month. Just often enough that nobody in the family completely forgot about it. One family member would occasionally catch sight of the figure standing at the end of a hallway. Another would glimpse it in a doorway. Someone else would see it briefly while walking through the house at night. The details never seemed to change. The figure was always tall, always dark, always silent, always standing still. And every encounter ended the same way. Someone would switch on a light. The figure would disappear. No evidence remained. No footprints, no sounds, nothing. Just an empty room. The family gradually stopped talking about it openly. Not because they forgot, because they couldn't explain it. Every attempt to rationalize the experiences fell apart when another family member reported seeing the same thing. Years passed. The children grew older. Life continued. Yet the silhouette remained part of the family's history. A strange mystery none of them could solve. When my teacher told me this story, she wasn't trying to convince me that ghosts exist. She wasn't looking for attention. In fact, she seemed almost uncomfortable discussing it. The memory clearly still bothered her. What stayed with her wasn't just seeing the figure. It was discovering that everyone else in the family had seen it too. If only one person reports an experience, it's easy to dismiss. Memory can be unreliable. The mind can play tricks. But when multiple people independently describe the same thing over many years, the story becomes much harder to ignore. Even now, I don't know what I believe happened. Maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there was some unusual visual phenomenon in the house. Maybe several family members unintentionally influenced each other's memories over time. Or maybe there was something else entirely. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that the image has remained stuck in my head ever since she told me the story. A dark house, two young sisters lying awake in bed, a tall silhouette standing silently in the doorway, and the chilling moment the next morning when their father looked up from the kitchen table and quietly asked, "Was the man you saw tall?" For me, that single question has always been the creepiest part of the entire story, because it suggests he already knew exactly what they had seen. One of the strangest stories from my teenage years happened during my junior year of high school. Even now, looking back on it as an adult, I still don't know what to think. I've gone over the events countless times, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but there are certain details that make the whole thing difficult to dismiss. At the time, I was like most teenagers. After school, I didn't always rush straight home. If a friend lived nearby and there was nothing important going on, I'd sometimes stop by their house for a while before heading home. On this particular day, I got off the bus a couple of stops early so I could hang out with a friend. It wasn't unusual. We'd done it plenty of times before. The afternoon started completely normally. We walked to his house, grabbed some snacks, and spent the next few hours playing video games. Nothing exciting happened. There were no mysterious events, no strange phone calls, and certainly nothing that would later become one of the weirdest stories my family still talks about. At some point while we were gaming, my friend's mom received a phone call. She stepped into the room and told me my mother wanted to speak with me. Immediately, I assumed I was in trouble. My first thought was that I'd been caught for not coming directly home after school. Teenagers aren't exactly known for keeping parents informed about every detail of their whereabouts, and I figured my mom was simply annoyed that I'd gone to a friend's house without telling her. When I got on the phone, however, her tone caught me off guard. She wasn't just irritated. She sounded angry. Really angry. But mixed in with that anger was something else. Fear, confusion, almost panic. She demanded to know where I was. I told her. She asked again. I repeated myself. Then she told me to come home immediately. The conversation was so intense that even my friend's mom looked concerned. As soon as I hung up, everyone in the room asked what was wrong. "I have no idea," I replied. And honestly, I didn't. The entire situation felt bizarre. I gathered my things and headed home, expecting a lecture about responsibility or staying out later than expected. Instead, I walked into something completely different. The moment I entered the house, I could tell something was off. The atmosphere felt strange. My mom looked stressed. My sister looked shaken. My sister's friend looked uncomfortable and nervous. Nobody appeared angry in the normal sense. They looked rattled, like something had genuinely frightened them. My mother immediately started questioning me. Where had I been? What had I done after school? Who had I been with? Had I come home at any point? The questions came one after another. I answered each one exactly the same way. I got off the bus. I went directly to my friend's house. I stayed there the entire time. I never came home. I never stopped anywhere else. I never left. For some reason, my mom didn't believe me. Not completely. She kept pressing, repeating the same questions, looking at me as though she expected me to suddenly confess something. The whole thing was incredibly frustrating because I genuinely had no idea what she thought I had done. Eventually, she sent me to my room. I remember sitting there completely confused. I replayed the day in my head, trying to figure out what had happened. Had someone seen someone who looked like me? Had there been some misunderstanding? Nothing made sense. A few minutes later, my sister came upstairs. Unlike my mother, she wasn't angry. She looked more curious than anything. She sat down and asked me exactly the same questions. Where had I been? Had I come home after school? Was I absolutely sure I'd been at my friend's house the entire time? I gave the same answers. Then I finally asked the obvious question. Why is everyone acting so weird? That's when she explained what had happened. Earlier that afternoon, while I was supposedly at my friend's house, my mom had been inside our home, doing whatever she happened to be doing. At some point, she heard someone call my name. The voice seemed to come from outside, specifically from the backyard. Naturally, she looked out the bedroom window. What she saw immediately caught her attention. Standing in the backyard were my sister and her friend. That part wasn't unusual. They often spent time outside. The unusual part was the third person standing with them. According to my mother, there was a shirtless young man standing behind my sister's friend. His arms were wrapped around her in what appeared to be an embrace. From the angle she was viewing them, my mother became convinced that the shirtless man was me. The figure had roughly my build, my age, my appearance. Everything seemed to fit. Immediately, she became furious. As far as she was concerned, I was supposed to be at school. Even if I had come home early, she certainly didn't expect to find me standing shirtless in the backyard, hugging my sister's friend. Her reaction was exactly what you'd expect from a protective parent. She stormed downstairs and headed outside. Apparently, she was already planning the lecture she intended to give me. The entire trip from the bedroom to the backyard took only moments, but when she stepped outside, everything changed. The shirtless man was gone. Completely gone. Only two people remained, my sister and her friend. Nobody else. My mother immediately demanded to know where I'd gone. Both girls looked confused. What do you mean? Where is he? Where is who? The boy that was standing here. They had no idea what she was talking about. According to both of them, there had never been anyone else in the backyard. Only the two of them. My mother didn't believe them, not for a second. She was convinced they were covering for me. From her perspective, she'd clearly seen someone. Not a shadow, not a vague shape, a person. A shirtless young man standing directly behind my sister's friend. She had watched him with her own eyes. The girls continued insisting there had never been anyone else present. The more they denied it, the more suspicious my mother became. Eventually, she concluded that I must be hiding somewhere nearby. She searched, asked more questions, demanded answers. Nothing. Nobody could explain what she'd seen. That's when she started trying to locate me. Eventually, she called my friend's house and discovered I was there. Yet even after speaking to me, she remained unconvinced. The image she'd witnessed felt too real, too detailed. She couldn't understand how I could simultaneously be at my friend's house and standing in the backyard. As my sister finished telling me the story, I started to understand why everyone seemed so unsettled. The situation was strange enough already, but there was another detail. A detail my mother didn't know at the time. A detail that transformed the entire story from odd to genuinely unsettling. My sister's friend hadn't come over for an ordinary visit. She had come because she was struggling emotionally. That particular day marked the 1-year anniversary of her fiancé's death. He had taken his own life exactly 1 year earlier. She was having a difficult time coping with the anniversary and wanted someone to talk to. That's why she was in our backyard with my sister, talking, remembering, trying to get through an emotionally painful day. My mother had no knowledge of any of this when she looked out the window. She didn't know why the friend was there. She didn't know what date it was. She didn't know what they were discussing. She knew nothing. Then came the detail that made everyone uncomfortable. Her fiancé and I shared the exact same first name. The moment that information entered the conversation, the room became quiet. Nobody really knew what to say. My mother insisted she had heard a male voice. She insisted she had seen a young man standing behind the friend. She insisted she had initially believed it was me. And yet I had an airtight alibi. Multiple people could confirm I had been somewhere else the entire afternoon. The more everyone thought about it, the stranger it seemed. My mother wasn't someone who normally claimed to see ghosts. She wasn't interested in paranormal stories. She was practical, skeptical, the type of person who looked for logical explanations. Yet she remained adamant about what she'd seen. Years later, she still maintained that she saw a person in the backyard. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A person. A young man standing behind my sister's friend. The same friend who happened to be grieving her deceased fiancé. A fiancé who shared my name. A fiancé whose death anniversary happened to be that exact day. I've spent years trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe there was someone else in the yard who left before my mother reached them. Maybe she misinterpreted what she saw from the window. Maybe the combination of distance, angle, and assumptions created an illusion. All of those explanations are possible, but they don't fully explain why she was so shaken. They don't explain why she remained convinced after discovering I was elsewhere. And they certainly don't explain why she heard a man's voice calling my name before looking outside. To this day, I don't claim to know what happened. Maybe there is a perfectly ordinary explanation. Maybe there isn't. All I know is that on the 1-year anniversary of a young man's death, his grieving fiancé sat in our backyard, talking with my sister. My mother heard a male voice. She looked outside and saw what she believed was a young man standing behind the grieving woman. She rushed outside. The figure vanished. And later she learned that the deceased fiancé she knew nothing about happened to share the same name as her son. Whether it was coincidence, misunderstanding, or something far stranger, it remains one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard firsthand from my own family. And years later, none of us have ever come up with an explanation that completely satisfies everyone. When I was 16 years old, I experienced something that remains one of the most terrifying memories of my life. Even now, years later, I still don't know exactly what happened that night. Part of me believes there must be a rational explanation. Another part of me remembers every detail so vividly that it's difficult to dismiss it entirely. Whether it was something supernatural, a waking nightmare, sleep paralysis, stress, or simply my imagination running wild, I can still see the image clearly whenever I think about it. At the time, I was living with my parents and going through what was probably a fairly stressful period of my life. Like most teenagers, I had plenty of things on my mind. School, family, friends, and all the other pressures that come with being 16 often left me feeling exhausted. For that particular weekend, my grandmother was staying with us. Because of limited space, she was sharing my room. I didn't mind. In fact, I usually enjoyed spending time with her. She always had interesting stories to tell, and having her around made the house feel different in a good way. That night seemed completely normal, and before going to bed, I followed my usual routine. One thing I always did after laundry was hang certain clothes on my bedroom doorframe to dry. It probably wasn't the most practical setup, but it worked. Shirts, pants, and jackets would often hang there overnight. When I finally climbed into bed, everything appeared ordinary. The room was quiet. The house was still. Nothing felt unusual. At some point during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't entirely sure why. The room was dark, illuminated only by faint moonlight filtering through the window. For several seconds, I lay there in that half-awake state where your brain hasn't fully caught up with reality. Then I noticed movement. Something was moving near the doorway, specifically among the clothes hanging from the doorframe. The fabric was shifting, rustling, as if someone were standing there moving through them. My first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion. I assumed it was one of my parents checking on me. Or perhaps my grandmother had gotten up during the night. Still groggy, I stared toward the doorway. That's when I noticed something strange. A pair of legs. They were visible through gaps in the hanging clothes. Even in the darkness, they looked wrong. The skin appeared gray. Not pale, gray. The legs looked unusually thin and covered with dark veins that stood out sharply against the skin. For a few seconds, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Then I noticed movement again. Something was passing through the hanging clothes. Long, thin shapes. At first, I thought they were sticks. Actual sticks. It made absolutely no sense, but that was honestly the closest comparison my sleepy brain could make. The objects moved slowly between the hanging shirts, back and forth, carefully, almost curiously. As my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, realization hit me. They weren't sticks, they were fingers. Extremely long fingers. Unnaturally long. The sight instantly made my stomach tighten. The figures standing in the doorway slowly became clearer. And what I saw remains one of the most horrifying things I have ever witnessed. The figure was incredibly thin, not simply skinny, emaciated. Its limbs looked fragile enough to snap under their own weight. At the same time, its stomach protruded outward in a strange, swollen way. The contrast made its appearance even more disturbing. The skin looked gray and unhealthy. Dark veins spread beneath the surface like tangled roots. Everything about it seemed wrong. As more details emerged from the darkness, my fear intensified. Its fingers were impossibly long. Its arms appeared too lengthy for its body. Its posture was hunched, almost twisted. Then I saw its face. Even now, I struggle to describe it. The face looked vaguely human, but distorted in a way that immediately triggered fear. Its chin stretched downward longer than seemed natural. Its eyes were enormous. What disturbed me most was that they appeared to have no eyelids. They simply stared, wide open, unblinking, fixed directly on me. The mouth was tiny compared to the rest of its face. Its lips puckered repeatedly as though it were sucking on an invisible lollipop. The movement was subtle but constant. Watching it made my skin crawl. The figure wore what looked like a hospital gown, or something similar. The fabric hung loosely around its body. Its back was hunched so dramatically that it appeared as though something beneath the skin was pushing outward. The entire silhouette looked twisted and unnatural. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't even process what I was seeing. My mind desperately searched for a logical explanation. Nothing fit. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was terribly wrong. The figure simply stood there, watching me. Then something happened that frightened me even more. It seemed surprised, not angry, not threatening, surprised, as though it hadn't expected me to wake up. as though it hadn't expected me to see it. The thought sent a wave of panic through me. Suddenly, my body snapped into action. I turned toward my grandmother and desperately tried to wake her. At first, I couldn't even scream properly. Fear had tightened my throat. All I could manage were weak, panicked sounds. I grabbed her shoulder, shook her, whispered loudly, then more urgently. The entire time I kept glancing back toward the doorway. The figure remained there, motionless, watching. Every time I looked at it, I noticed another disturbing detail. Its head seemed unusually large, almost cone-shaped. Its skin looked shriveled, completely hairless. Its expression never changed. Neither did its posture. The only movement came from those strange lips and the occasional twitch of its long fingers. My grandmother still hadn't fully awakened. The panic became overwhelming. I shook her harder. Finally, she stirred, slowly opening her eyes. The moment she became alert enough to understand my panic, she turned toward the doorway, and just like that, it was gone. The space where it had been standing was empty. The hanging clothes remained perfectly still. The doorway looked completely normal. Nothing was there. I remember staring in disbelief. 1 second, the figure had been present. The next, it had vanished. There was no sound, no movement, no indication of where it had gone. Just empty space. My grandmother asked what was wrong. I struggled to explain. Even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. Yet I knew what I had seen. Or at least I believed I did. The strange part is that the experience didn't occur in isolation. For several weeks leading up to that night, unusual things had been happening around the house. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make me uneasy. At times, my bedroom door would slam unexpectedly. Occasionally, it seemed to lock itself. I would hear strange noises at night that I couldn't explain. Most of the time, I convinced myself there were ordinary explanations. Old houses make noises. Doors shift. Locks stick. But the incidents kept accumulating. Then there were the nightmares. They became increasingly intense during that period. Not normal nightmares. The kind that wake you abruptly with your heart racing. One night, I woke up convinced that several hands were touching my feet and legs. The sensation felt completely real. By the time I sat upright, however, nothing was there. Experiences like that left me exhausted and anxious. As the weeks passed, I began sleeping poorly. I constantly felt on edge. Then came the encounter with the gray figure. After that, I finally told my parents everything, not just about the figure, about the door, the nightmares, the sensations, all of it. To their credit, they listened. Whether they believed every detail or not, they could see how frightened I was. Eventually, they decided to have my room blessed and spiritually cleansed. Some people would call it an exorcism. Others would call it a blessing. Whatever term is used, someone came to the house and performed prayers over the room. At the time, I desperately wanted it to help, and strangely enough, it did. Afterward, the disturbances stopped. The nightmares faded. The feelings of being watched disappeared. The strange incidents ceased. Life gradually returned to normal. Now, years later, I often wonder what really happened. Maybe the cleansing worked. Maybe it provided psychological comfort that allowed me to relax. Maybe stress and anxiety had been creating experiences that felt real. Sleep deprivation can do strange things to the mind. So can fear. So can expectation. I'm open to all of those possibilities. What I do know is that I never experienced anything similar again. Not once. The figure never returned. The touching sensation stopped. The nightmares ended. Everything simply disappeared. To this day, I still don't know whether I encountered something genuinely paranormal or whether my teenage brain created something terrifying during a period of stress and poor sleep. Maybe I'll never know. But regardless of the explanation, the memory remains vivid. I can still picture that dark doorway, the hanging clothes shifting softly, the gray skin, the enormous eyes, the impossibly long fingers, and the unsettling feeling that whatever stood there was just as shocked to see me as I was to see it. One thing is certain, though. Ever since that night, I have never been comfortable sleeping with a bedroom door open, and I probably never will be. When I was in elementary school, my family decided it was time to expand our house. At the time, it seemed like an exciting project. I imagined new rooms, fresh paint, and all the changes that would come with having a larger home. What I didn't realize was that the construction project would drag on for years and eventually leave me with one of the creepiest realizations of my childhood. Our house wasn't an ordinary modern home. It was an old colonial-style house that my parents cared deeply about preserving. They loved historical architecture and wanted everything to remain as authentic as possible. The house had many original features, including old softwood floors, historically accurate paint colors, and design details that matched the period when the home was originally built. Because of that, every decision involving the renovation became a major discussion. My parents hired an architect and a contractor to design and build the addition. Initially, everyone seemed enthusiastic about the project. The plans looked great, and my parents were excited to improve the house while maintaining its historical character. One issue quickly became a major problem, though: the wood trim. My parents wanted all of the trim in the new addition painted to match the rest of the house. It was important to them that the new section blended seamlessly with the original structure. The contractor disagreed strongly. He argued that the wood being used was high-quality material and that painting it would be a waste. He felt the natural wood grain should remain visible. What started as a simple disagreement eventually turned into a constant source of conflict. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into nearly a year. The project barely moved forward. Despite being paid regularly, the contractor and his crew made very little progress. Arguments became routine. Deadlines came and went. The entire renovation seemed stuck. Eventually, my parents had enough. After nearly a year of frustration, they decided to fire the contractor and find someone else. The replacement contractor came through a trusted source. My parents' lawyer knew him through church and spoke highly of him. Most of the contractor's employees also attended the same church, which gave my parents additional confidence. At the time, that seemed reassuring. These weren't random workers hired off the street. They appeared to be people connected through a community that my parents trusted. Construction finally resumed. This new team actually worked. Progress became visible almost immediately. Walls went up. Rooms took shape. The addition slowly started looking like part of a real house. As a child, I spent a lot of time around the workers. Not because I was helping, of course, but because construction was fascinating to me. There were always interesting tools, loud noises, and things being built. My parents also made a point of being kind and hospitable to everyone working on our home. We lived in a region with extremely hot, humid summers. The kind of weather where stepping outside for 5 minutes could leave you sweating. Because of that, my mom often prepared drinks and snacks for the crew. Cold lemonade, bottled water, cookies, chips, simple things that helped make long workdays a little easier. Since I was a kid and enjoyed feeling helpful, my mother would often ask me to bring the refreshments outside. I didn't mind. In fact, I enjoyed it. The workers were always friendly. Most of them would stop what they were doing long enough to thank me. Some would joke around. Others would ask how school was going. To a young child, they all seemed nice. Looking back, they probably viewed me the same way most adults view children. A kid trying to be helpful, a harmless part of the household. Among the workers, one stood out more than the others. His name was Kenny. I remember him clearly because he seemed to be the person running things most of the time. Oddly enough, the actual contractor rarely appeared at the job site. Kenny was often the one organizing tasks, answering questions, and coordinating the daily work. Even though he wasn't technically in charge, he seemed to function as the main point of contact. Because of that, I interacted with him more than most of the crew. He was always friendly, patient, polite. Whenever I brought drinks outside, he would thank me. Sometimes we would chat briefly, usually about whatever random topic happened to interest a 9-year-old girl. School, pets, television shows. The kinds of conversations adults often have with children. Nothing about those interactions felt unusual. Nothing made me uncomfortable. Nothing seemed suspicious. If someone had asked me back then which worker I remembered most positively, I probably would have mentioned Kenny. The construction project continued for what felt like forever. Eventually, the addition was completed. If I remember correctly, the entire process took around 2.5 years from beginning to end. By the time it was finished, everyone was relieved. The workers moved on. Life returned to normal. The renovation became just another part of our family history. Months passed. Then one day, everything changed. I don't remember exactly how much time had gone by after construction ended. What I do remember is hearing adults discussing something in serious voices. My parents had discovered an article in the newspaper. The article included a familiar name, Kenny. At first, the name didn't mean much to me. Then I realized who they were talking about. The worker from our house, the friendly guy who had spent years helping build the addition, the one who always seemed nice. The article explained that he had been arrested and sent to prison on charges involving children. As a child, I didn't fully understand the details. I only understood enough to recognize that it was something terrible. As I got older and learned more about the situation, the reality became even more disturbing. Apparently, before he ever worked at our house, he had already been listed as a registered sex offender. This wasn't information that came to light after his arrest. It already existed. The contractor knew, or at least should have known. Yet nobody informed my parents. Nobody warned them. Nobody mentioned that one of the people working around their children had a history that parents would almost certainly want to know about. The more I thought about it, the worse it felt. At the time, I had been a young elementary school girl. My brother was in middle school. There were occasions when my parents left us at home while the workers were there. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing inappropriate occurred. No boundaries were crossed. But knowing what we later learned changed how those memories felt. Suddenly, situations that once seemed harmless became unsettling. I thought about all the conversations, the times I carried drinks outside by myself, the afternoons spent around the construction site, the casual trust everyone had placed in the workers. Again, nothing happened. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful. But the realization that something could have happened was enough. As a child, you assume adults are protecting you. You assume the people allowed into your home have been vetted. You assume your parents know who they're dealing with. Finding out later that critical information had been withheld created a strange feeling that stayed with me for years. What made it even more unsettling was how normal everything had seemed. That's the part that really sticks with me. When people imagine dangerous individuals, they often picture someone obviously suspicious, someone who immediately triggers alarm bells. Real life isn't usually like that. The people who cause concern often appear completely ordinary, friendly, polite, helpful, trustworthy. Kenny never acted like the monster described in the newspaper, at least not around us. He looked like any other worker, talked like any other worker, behaved like any other worker. And that's what makes the realization so disturbing. The threat wasn't obvious. It was hidden behind a normal smile and ordinary conversations. As I grew older, I found myself reflecting on the situation more often. Not because of anything that happened, because of what could have happened. The difference matters. This isn't a story about an attack or a crime committed against my family. It's a story about discovering years later that someone we trusted should never have been placed in that position of trust to begin with. The responsibility ultimately rested with the contractor. Parents deserve to know who is being brought into their homes, especially when children are involved. Choosing not to disclose information like that wasn't simply irresponsible. It was dangerous. Even now, when I think back on those years, I mostly remember a normal childhood construction project. I remember lemonade on hot summer afternoons. I remember workers hammering and sawing. I remember watching rooms slowly take shape. And then I remember opening a newspaper and learning that one of the people who had been part of those memories was someone entirely different than we believed. Nothing happened to me. Nothing happened to my brother. For that, I remain incredibly thankful. But the realization itself still gives me chills, because sometimes the scariest stories aren't about things that happen. They're about the things that almost did, and the knowledge that danger can exist much closer than anyone realizes. I've rewritten the story into a smooth, immersive narrative suitable for a YouTube storytelling channel while staying faithful to the original events. This story happened to my dad, and to this day, it's one of the few things I've ever seen genuinely shake him. My dad has never been the type to make up stories or exaggerate events for attention. He's a practical, level-headed person who usually has an explanation for everything. In fact, even now, whenever he tells this story, I can see the hairs on his arms stand up. He still gets goosebumps, and there's a look in his eyes that tells me the memory never really left him. The experience happened about 6 months ago when my parents decided to spend a few days away at a beach house owned by some close family friends. It was supposed to be a relaxing vacation. The beach house sat in a quiet coastal area, far from the noise and stress of everyday life, the kind of place where the nights were peaceful, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was the only thing you could hear after dark. Our friends had owned the property for about 3 years, and during that time, they had occasionally mentioned the house next door. There was always something strange about it. For reasons nobody seemed able to explain, the property had gone through 5 different owners in just 3 years. Every time someone moved in, they would leave not long afterward. At first, everyone assumed it was just coincidence. Maybe the location wasn't right for them. Maybe they had financial problems. Whatever the reason, people never stayed long. The most recent owner had died only a few weeks before my parents arrived. According to what our friends had heard, the man had taken his own life inside the house around 3 weeks earlier. Nobody seemed to know why. There were rumors, of course, but no one had any real answers. It was simply one of those tragic events that people talked about quietly before changing the subject. My parents thought it was sad, but they didn't give it much thought. They were there to relax, enjoy the beach, and spend some time away from home. The day they arrived was completely normal. The weather was beautiful. They unpacked their things, spent time walking along the shoreline, and enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere. Nothing felt unusual. There were no strange noises, no eerie feelings, and nothing that would have suggested what was coming later that night. As evening settled in, they returned to the house, had dinner, watched a little television, and began getting ready for bed. Everything still seemed perfectly ordinary. Then my dad noticed something. While moving around the house, he caught a faint smell of gas. At first, he wasn't sure if he was imagining it. He sniffed the air again and immediately realized something was wrong. The smell was definitely there. Concerned, he started checking around the house to find the source. After a few minutes, he discovered that the pilot light had gone out. Not wanting to take any chances, he decided to go outside and shut off the gas. My mom stayed inside while he grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the darkness. The moment he stepped outside, something changed. He told me that he couldn't explain it then, and he still can't explain it now. A sudden chill ran through his body. It wasn't because of the weather. The night wasn't particularly cold, yet he felt an icy sensation crawl across his skin. The feeling only grew stronger as he walked farther from the house. Every instinct told him that something wasn't right. The darkness around him felt heavier than it should have. The area was quiet, too quiet. Even the distant sound of the ocean seemed strangely muted. As he searched for the gas shutoff valve, he became increasingly nervous. He couldn't understand why. Nothing was happening. There was nobody around. And yet he felt as though he wasn't alone. He later described it as the overwhelming sensation of being watched. The kind of feeling that makes you constantly glance over your shoulder even when you know nobody should be there. Trying to ignore it, he continued searching until he finally located the shutoff valve. Just as he reached down to turn it off, he heard a voice. "What are you doing?" The words came from right behind him. Not in the distance, not carried by the wind. Right behind him. The voice was so clear, so natural, and so real that my dad reacted without even thinking. "Shutting off the gas," he answered. The response came automatically. For a brief moment, he thought he was simply talking to another person. Then reality hit him. His heart stopped. He realized there wasn't supposed to be anyone there. The moment the words left his mouth, a wave of panic crashed over him. He froze, every muscle in his body locked up. The night suddenly felt colder. Slowly, he turned around. Nothing. No one was standing behind him. No one was walking nearby. There was nobody hiding in the shadows. The area was completely empty. For a few seconds, he just stood there staring into the darkness, trying desperately to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was my mom, he thought. Maybe she had stepped outside without him noticing. That explanation made sense, at least for a moment. But as he looked around, he couldn't see her anywhere. The yard was empty. The neighboring properties were dark and silent. There wasn't another person in sight. And yet he knew exactly what he had heard. The voice hadn't sounded distant or unclear. It hadn't sounded like the wind. It hadn't sounded like his imagination. It sounded like someone standing right beside him, someone speaking directly into the night. A rush of fear swept through him. He abandoned any attempt to figure it out. Instead, he hurried back toward the house as fast as he could. By the time he got inside, his heart was pounding. He immediately searched for my mom. If she had somehow stepped outside and spoken to him, then at least there would be a reasonable explanation. But when he found her, she was standing in the bathroom brushing her teeth. She hadn't been outside. She hadn't called his name. She hadn't spoken to him at all. My dad asked if she had gone outside while he was shutting off the gas. She looked confused and said no. She had been in the bathroom the entire time. The answer made his stomach drop. because it confirmed what he already feared. The voice couldn't have been hers. That night, neither of them felt comfortable. My dad couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. The voice had been too real. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard those words again. What are you doing? Hours passed, but sleep never came. The house felt different now. Every creak seemed louder. Every shadow seemed darker. The peaceful vacation atmosphere had completely vanished. Instead, there was a constant feeling of unease hanging over everything. Eventually, sometime around 3 in the morning, my parents decided they had enough. Neither one of them wanted to stay another minute. They packed their things, got into the car, and left. The roads were nearly empty as they drove home through the darkness. Only once they were far away from the beach house did my dad begin to feel slightly calmer. Even then, he couldn't shake the experience. A few days later, they told our friends what had happened. The reaction they received was not what they expected. As soon as my parents described the voice and what it had said, our friends reportedly went pale. The expression on their faces immediately changed. They looked genuinely disturbed. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then they explained something my parents hadn't known. The man who had lived in the neighboring house, the one who had died only a few weeks earlier, had apparently taken his own life using gas. The room fell silent. My dad felt a chill run through him all over again. The memory of that voice suddenly seemed even more unsettling. He had been standing outside specifically to shut off a gas leak when the voice appeared. The connection was impossible to ignore. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe there was some logical explanation nobody had thought of. Maybe stress, darkness, and the strange atmosphere had played tricks on his mind. My dad has considered every possibility over the years, but one thing has never changed. He remains absolutely convinced that he heard someone speak to him that night. Not a sound, not a whisper carried by the wind. A voice, clear, direct, human. A voice that asked a simple question, and a voice that came from a place where nobody was standing. What affects me most isn't the story itself. It's the way my dad reacts whenever he tells it. I've known him my entire life. I've seen him handle difficult situations without flinching. I've seen him stay calm when everyone else was panicking. Fear is not an emotion I associate with him. Yet every single time this story comes up, something changes. His expression becomes serious. The room grows quiet. And as he reaches the part about the voice, goosebumps spread across his arms. Even after all this time, the memory still unsettles him. Could there be a perfectly normal explanation? Maybe. I'm sure some people would say there is. But whenever I remember the look in my dad's eyes the first time he told me what happened, I find it hard to believe he imagined it. People can fake stories. People can exaggerate details. But genuine fear is much harder to fake. And the fear I saw in my dad that day looked very, very real. I've rewritten the story into a smoother, more immersive narrative while preserving the original events and emotional impact. My mother told me this story years ago, and even now she doesn't know what to make of it. What makes it especially strange is that my mother is a deeply religious Christian. She's never been the type to believe in ghosts, spirits wandering the earth, or anything remotely supernatural. If anything, she's usually the first person to look for a practical explanation. Yet this is one story she has never been able to explain. The events took place many years ago and involved my mother's grandmother, Florence. By the time all of this happened, Florence was already quite elderly and suffering from severe dementia. Her memory had become unreliable, and there were days when she seemed to drift between the present and the past without realizing it. Some moments she was perfectly lucid, while others left family members wondering what world she was living in. One example always stood out to everyone. Florence had owned a beloved little dog named Fluffy for many years. When Fluffy eventually died, Florence was devastated. The dog had been her constant companion, especially during her later years when loneliness had become more common. Unable to bear the thought of saying goodbye completely, she had Fluffy cremated. Instead of scattering the ashes, she placed the urn on the mantel above her fireplace. To Florence, Fluffy was still part of the household. Whenever family members came to visit, she insisted they greet the dog. My mother remembered visiting as a young woman and being instructed to walk over to the mantel, pick up the urn, gently shake it, and say hello. "Go on," Florence would say. "Say hi to Fluffy." As odd as it seemed, everyone humored her. After all, Florence's dementia had already begun affecting her behavior, and arguing rarely accomplished anything. Life continued this way for some time until tragedy struck the family. Florence had a daughter named Lucy. One day, Aunt Lucy died unexpectedly. The loss hit everyone hard. There had been no warning and no time to prepare. One moment she was part of their lives, and the next she was gone. The family immediately began making funeral arrangements. As they worked through the difficult process, one concern kept coming up. How would Florence handle the news? Her dementia had worsened significantly by that point, and everyone worried that learning about Lucy's death before the funeral might overwhelm her. They feared the shock could seriously affect her already fragile mental and emotional state. After discussing it extensively, the family made a difficult decision. They would wait until after the funeral to tell Florence. It wasn't a choice anyone felt good about, but they genuinely believed it was the kindest option available. So the arrangements moved forward without her knowledge. They selected the funeral home, met with the staff, and handled all the details that follow a death. Since Lucy hadn't left specific instructions regarding what she wanted to be buried in, the family purchased a new dress for her funeral. Everything was organized as respectfully as possible. The service was held with family and friends in attendance. One decision, however, would later take on unexpected significance. The funeral featured an open casket. At the time, it seemed like a normal choice. Family members wanted one final opportunity to say goodbye. Yet several people remembered something Lucy had mentioned years earlier. She had once casually commented that she didn't like open casket funerals. In fact, she had jokingly said that if she ever died, she wouldn't want people standing around staring at her body. The remark had never been treated as a serious request. It was simply one of those random conversations people have and later forget. So despite her dislike of the idea, the funeral proceeded with an open casket. The next day, family members gathered and finally prepared to tell Florence the truth. Everyone was nervous. No one knew how she would react. Some worried she wouldn't understand. Others feared she would become confused, frightened, or deeply distressed. When they arrived, they sat down with her and carefully explained that Lucy had passed away. But before they could finish explaining, Florence interrupted them. She looked troubled. Not sad, not shocked. Troubled. As though something had been bothering her. Before anyone could continue, she spoke. "I need your help," she said. The family exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" someone asked. Florence frowned. "Lucy was here yesterday." The room immediately became quiet. Several people assumed she was confused. After all, confusion was common for Florence, but she continued speaking before anyone could respond. "She came by yesterday, and she was upset." Now everyone was paying attention. Florence looked genuinely concerned. She kept saying the same thing over and over. The family listened carefully. "What did she say?" someone finally asked. Florence's expression tightened. She said, "They're looking at me. I don't like them looking at me. I told you I didn't want them looking at me." A chill settled over the room. Nobody spoke. The words felt strangely familiar. Several family members immediately remembered Lucy's old comments about open casket funerals. The comments she had made years before. The comments Florence had never heard. Yet Florence was repeating a complaint that sounded remarkably similar. The silence stretched. Eventually someone tried to gently explain. "Grandma, that's not possible." Florence looked confused. "What isn't possible?" "Lucy couldn't have been here." "Of course she was." "No, Grandma." They exchanged nervous glances before continuing. "Lucy died." Florence stared at them as if they had said something ridiculous. For a moment, she simply blinked. Then she shook her head. "Dead?" The word seemed absurd to her. "No, she can't be dead." The family sat frozen. "Grandma." "No," Florence insisted. "She was just here yesterday." Her certainty was unsettling. She wasn't rambling. She wasn't speaking incoherently. She sounded completely convinced. The room remained silent as she continued. She seemed upset. Again, no one interrupted. Then Florence said something that would leave the family shaken for years afterward. She was wearing the strangest dress. The atmosphere in the room instantly changed. "What dress?" someone asked carefully. Florence began describing it. At first, the family listened with mild curiosity. Then their expressions changed. Every detail she mentioned matched the dress Lucy had been buried in. The color, the style, the neckline, the sleeves, the fabric. One detail after another. Florence described it with remarkable accuracy. The problem was that she had never seen it before. Not in person, not in photographs, not anywhere. The dress had been purchased after Lucy's death specifically for the funeral. Florence had not attended the service. She had not viewed the body. She had not seen the casket. She had never been shown pictures. In fact, the family had gone to great lengths to keep all funeral details from her until afterward. Yet somehow she described the outfit perfectly. Family members began asking questions. "Are you sure that's what she was wearing?" Florence looked irritated. "Of course I'm sure." "What else can you remember?" She repeated the description again. The details remained exactly the same. Not vague approximations. Not lucky guesses. Specific details. The kind of details someone would normally only know by seeing the dress. The family didn't know what to say. Some attempted to rationalize it. Maybe Florence had overheard a conversation. Maybe someone accidentally mentioned the outfit. Maybe she saw a shopping receipt. Maybe dementia had caused her imagination to produce an incredible coincidence. One by one, every explanation fell apart. No one could identify a way she could have known. And Florence remained unwavering. To her, there was nothing mysterious about the situation. Lucy had simply stopped by. That was all. She had visited her mother, complained about people staring at her, and left. Florence seemed far more puzzled by everyone else's confusion than by her own story. For the rest of her life, she never changed her account. She never retracted it. She never admitted uncertainty. Whenever the subject came up, she told the same story. Lucy had visited. She was unhappy. People were looking at her, and she was wearing an unfamiliar dress. Years later, my mother still remembers the reaction of the family members who were present that day. Many of them weren't people who believed in ghost stories. They weren't looking for supernatural explanations. Yet none of them could explain how Florence knew what she knew. What makes the story so memorable isn't necessarily the possibility of a ghost. It's the complete lack of a reasonable answer. Florence's dementia often caused confusion, forgotten names, and strange conversations. Yet in this one instance, she described something she should have had absolutely no way of knowing. My mother has spent years thinking about it. As a person of faith, she doesn't believe in ghosts haunting houses or wandering the earth. Even so, she freely admits that she has never found a satisfying explanation for what happened. Maybe there is one. Maybe someone unknowingly mentioned the dress. Maybe Florence overheard something and retained it despite her condition. Maybe it was all an extraordinary coincidence. But whenever my mother tells the story, she always pauses at the same point. The moment Florence described the dress no one had shown her, the dress she had never seen, the dress that matched perfectly. And every time the story ends, my mother says exactly the same thing. I don't know what happened. I only know that nobody ever figured it out. I've rewritten the story into a more immersive, YouTube-friendly narrative while staying faithful to the original events and atmosphere. I've always considered myself a skeptic. I've never been the type of person who believes in ghosts, haunted houses, spirits, or anything supernatural. Whenever someone told a paranormal story, I was usually the first one trying to come up with a logical explanation. That's why what happened while I was living in an old apartment in Oslo still bothers me years later. I can't honestly say the place was haunted. I don't know what was going on there. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. Maybe it was all coincidence. But even now, when I think back on that apartment, I remember the feeling it gave me more than anything else. The building itself was old, very old. It had been standing since the mid-1800s, and despite renovations over the years, you could still feel its age. The floors creaked constantly. The walls seemed to hold on to every sound. At night, the building would settle and groan in ways that made it seem almost alive. At first, I thought it was charming. I moved in with 2 other women, and for the most part, everything seemed normal. The apartment was spacious, and the location was great. There was no reason to think anything unusual was waiting for us there. Yet from the very beginning, something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't something I could point to specifically. It was more like a feeling, a constant sense of unease that seemed to linger in certain parts of the apartment. Most people have experienced that sensation at some point. The feeling that a room somehow feels different from the rest of a building, even when there's no obvious reason for it. In our apartment, there was one room that affected me more than any other. I hated going into it. There was nothing visibly strange about the room. It wasn't damaged. It wasn't dirty. There were no unusual smells or sounds. But every time I stepped through the doorway, an overwhelming discomfort washed over me. The room always felt colder than the rest of the apartment. Not slightly cooler, noticeably colder. You could walk through the apartment comfortably and then enter that room and immediately feel the difference. At first, I assumed it was poor insulation or a draft coming from somewhere. That seemed like the obvious explanation. But the cold wasn't the only thing. Whenever I spent time in that room, disturbing thoughts would begin creeping into my mind. Not memories, not daydreams. More like flashes of emotion and imagery that seemed to appear from nowhere. I would suddenly find myself thinking about children crying. Sometimes I would imagine children being frightened or in danger. Other times I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness that I couldn't explain. The thoughts weren't detailed enough to form actual stories, but they were persistent. Every single time I entered the room, they returned. I can't explain why. I know how strange that sounds. The room itself never contained anything unusual. There were no pictures or objects that should have triggered those thoughts, yet they always appeared. Eventually, I started avoiding the room altogether. If I had a reason to go in, I got whatever I needed and left as quickly as possible. The longer I stayed, the worse the feeling became. My roommates knew I disliked the room, but I never really discussed the details with them because I knew how ridiculous it sounded. Even saying it out loud made me feel silly. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. As unsettling as that room was, the most frightening experience happened in my own bedroom. My room had originally been the apartment's living room many years earlier. It was one of the largest rooms in the apartment, with high ceilings and tall windows that reflected the building's age. For several months, everything was perfectly normal. Then one morning, I woke up to something I'll never forget. At first, I wasn't fully awake. I was lying in bed in that strange state between sleeping and consciousness when I became aware of a sound. A low growl, deep, aggressive, animal-like. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. Then the sound came again. It was louder this time. The best comparison I can make is that it sounded like a large cat warning an intruder to stay away. At the same time, it also reminded me of an angry dog baring its teeth before an attack. The sound was close, extremely close, as if the animal was standing right next to my bed. My eyes snapped open. The room was empty, but the growling continued. A wave of terror shot through me. I tried to sit up. I couldn't. My entire body was frozen. I was completely unable to move. Panic flooded through me instantly. I struggled with everything I had, trying to move my arms, my legs, even my head. Nothing happened. The growling seemed to fill the room. Every instinct told me there was something there with me, something dangerous. Yet no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything. The room appeared completely empty. The combination of being unable to move and hearing that sound created a level of fear I've rarely experienced in my life. I remember my heart pounding so hard that it felt painful. Every second seemed to stretch endlessly. I kept trying to force my body to move. Nothing worked. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. The growling stopped. The pressure holding me down disappeared. I could move again. I sat up immediately, breathing heavily and looking around the room. Nothing. No animal. No intruder. No explanation. The apartment was completely quiet. For a long time afterward, I sat there trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Perhaps it was some form of sleep paralysis. Perhaps my brain was still partially dreaming. Those explanations made sense, yet the memory remained disturbingly vivid. It had felt incredibly real, far more real than any dream I had ever experienced. Even now, I can still remember the sound. The apartment's atmosphere seemed to grow heavier after that. Whether it was because of my experience or because I was paying closer attention, I don't know. But living there became increasingly uncomfortable. Then something happened that shook all of us. One of my roommates owned a cat. The cat was young, healthy, and full of energy. It wasn't even a year old. Like most young cats, it spent its days running around the apartment, climbing furniture, and demanding attention from anyone willing to provide it. There had never been any indication that something was wrong. One evening, all three of us were relaxing together in the apartment. It was an ordinary night. We were talking, laughing, and enjoying ourselves. Then we heard a sound. At first, none of us recognized it. It was coming from the bathroom. A horrible, desperate noise. The kind of sound that immediately tells you something is seriously wrong. We rushed toward the bathroom. The cat was lying on the floor. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Its tongue was hanging out. It was struggling desperately to breathe. Its body was trembling. Each breath sounded like a painful gasp. The noises coming from it were awful. There was panic in them, pain, desperation. My roommate immediately dropped to her knees beside it. We all began trying to figure out what was happening. Had it eaten something? Was it choking? Had it somehow been injured? Nothing made sense. Only minutes earlier, the cat had seemed completely normal. Now it looked as though it was fighting for its life. We felt helpless. The cat continued gasping for air. The sounds it made became weaker and weaker. Time seemed to move strangely. The entire ordeal lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. Eventually, the cat stopped moving. The bathroom fell silent. None of us knew what to say. One moment, it had been a healthy young animal. The next, it was gone. The experience devastated my roommate. It also deepened the unsettling atmosphere that already seemed to surround the apartment. Of course, I know animals can die unexpectedly. Medical conditions can exist without obvious symptoms. There may have been a completely natural explanation, but witnessing it happen so suddenly felt disturbing in a way that's difficult to describe. After that, I found myself becoming increasingly uncomfortable in the apartment. The strange room, the unexplained thoughts, the terrifying experience in my bedroom, the sudden death of the cat. Each event by itself could probably be explained. Taken together, however, they created an atmosphere that was impossible to ignore. I began dreading coming home. At night, I found myself listening to every creak in the building. Every unusual sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed darker. I never actually saw anything. I never witnessed objects moving. There were no apparitions floating through hallways. Nothing that would fit the stereotypical image of a haunted house. And yet the apartment felt wrong. That feeling never went away. If anything, it grew stronger over time. Eventually, I reached a point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to move out. The decision wasn't based on any single incident. It was the cumulative effect of everything. The constant discomfort, the anxiety, the feeling that I never truly felt at ease inside those walls. After I left, an enormous sense of relief settled over me. Almost immediately, I noticed the difference. The tension I had been carrying seemed to disappear. I slept better. I felt calmer. Life returned to normal. Years later, I still consider myself a skeptic. I still don't claim that the apartment was haunted. I still believe there are probably logical explanations for most things people label as paranormal. But if someone asked me whether I've ever lived somewhere that genuinely unsettled me, my answer would be yes, without question. That old apartment in Oslo remains the most unnerving place I've ever lived. Maybe it was nothing more than an old building with strange quirks and a few unfortunate coincidences. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation for every single event. But even now, whenever I remember those cold rooms, the unexplained sense of dread, the terrifying growling that woke me from sleep, and the sudden death of that young cat, I can't help feeling the same chill I felt back then. Whatever the truth was, I was more than happy to leave that place behind. I've rewritten the story into a more detailed, immersive narrative, while preserving the original events and unsettling atmosphere. This happened when I was around 15 or 16 years old, and even now it's one of the strangest and most unsettling things I've ever witnessed. I've told the story a handful of times over the years, but every time I do, people either get chills or immediately start trying to come up with a logical explanation. Honestly, I still don't know what to think. At the time, my little sister was only 3 or 4 years old. She was at that age where curiosity seemed to outweigh common sense. Like most young children, she wanted to imitate everything the adults around her did. If she saw someone brushing their teeth, she wanted to brush hers. If she saw someone talking on the phone, she wanted to pretend she was on a phone too. Looking back, that's probably what led to what happened that day. It started as an ordinary afternoon at home. Nothing unusual was happening. My parents were busy with normal household activities, and I was doing whatever a teenager typically does when they're trying to avoid being bored. At some point, my little sister wandered into the bathroom. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Then everything suddenly changed. A few moments later, someone realized she had gotten hold of a bottle containing green nail polish remover that had been left near the bathroom sink. To a small child, it apparently looked a lot like mouthwash. Our best guess was that she had seen our parents rinsing their mouths before and decided she wanted to do the same thing. Except, instead of mouthwash, she swallowed some of the nail polish remover. The moment we realized what had happened, panic spread through the house. Everyone started moving at once. My parents were trying to figure out exactly how much she had swallowed while also contacting people who might be able to help. This happened years ago before everyone immediately reached for a smartphone to search for emergency advice. Fortunately, our neighborhood pharmacy responded incredibly quickly. An assistant rushed over with ipecac syrup and another medication that I vaguely remember being something like Malox, though I honestly can't say for sure after all these years. What I do remember clearly is the waiting. Anyone who has ever experienced a medical emergency involving a child knows how agonizing those moments can be. Every minute feels longer than it actually is. Everyone was scared. Everyone was worried. And nobody knew exactly how serious the situation was going to become. My little sister had begun complaining that her stomach hurt. Eventually, she ended up lying on the bathroom floor. The atmosphere in the house was tense and frightening. Adults were moving around her, talking quickly, trying to stay calm while clearly terrified. I remember standing nearby feeling helpless. Then my sister started talking. At first, nobody paid much attention. We assumed she was simply responding to the discomfort she was feeling. But then she said something that caused everyone in the room to stop. Completely stop. The kind of sudden silence where you become aware that every person present is staring at the same thing. Lying there on the bathroom floor, holding her stomach, my 3 or 4-year-old sister looked up and calmly said, "I drank some green stuff and died one time." For a moment, nobody responded. The statement was so unexpected that it didn't immediately register. Then she continued, "My husband ran off with a girl." The room became very quiet. Even as a teenager, I remember feeling confused. A husband? What husband? She was a preschooler. The words coming out of her mouth sounded completely disconnected from anything a child her age should have been talking about. Before anyone could ask a question, she kept going. "My husband ran away with a girl, and I got sad." Her voice was calm, matter of fact, almost as if she were describing something she remembered rather than inventing a story. Then she said the part that sent chills through everyone in the room. "I drank some green stuff and died." The bathroom fell silent. I remember looking around and seeing the expressions on everyone's faces. Confusion, disbelief, shock. Nobody knew what to say. The situation was already stressful enough because of what had happened. Now this tiny child was casually describing what sounded disturbingly similar to the exact thing she had just done. She had swallowed a green liquid, and now she was talking about drinking a green liquid and dying. But she wasn't finished. My girls were crying when I died. She paused briefly. They were sad. That was it. No dramatic buildup, no strange behavior afterward. Just a few simple statements delivered with complete sincerity. Then she returned to being an upset little child with a stomachache. For several moments, nobody spoke. The adults exchanged nervous glances. I remember feeling a strange chill despite the chaos of the situation. It wasn't because I suddenly believed in ghosts or reincarnation. It was because of how odd the entire thing felt. Where had she gotten those ideas? At 3 or 4 years old, my sister barely understood basic relationships. The concept of having a husband was far beyond anything that normally occupied her thoughts. And daughters? She certainly didn't have any. Yet she spoke as though she had once lived an entirely different life. A life involving a marriage, heartbreak, and children. Of course, once the immediate medical emergency passed, everyone's attention returned to making sure she was okay. Thankfully, she recovered. The medications arrived, the situation was handled, and she suffered no lasting effects from the accident. In the end, she was perfectly fine. The strange conversation, however, never left us. Over the following years, family members occasionally brought it up. Whenever they did, the details remained exactly the same. A little girl, a green liquid, a husband leaving her, children crying after her death. The similarities between her story and what had just happened that day made it impossible to forget. Naturally, people offered explanations. Maybe she had overheard part of a television show. Maybe she had heard adults discussing something and misunderstood it. Maybe it was simply a child's imagination creating a bizarre story during a stressful moment. Those explanations are certainly possible. In fact, they're probably the most likely explanations. Children absorb far more information than adults often realize. They hear conversations, they see scenes on television, they repeat fragments of things they've encountered without understanding their full meaning. Yet there was still something about the timing that felt eerie. Of all the things she could have said while lying on that bathroom floor, she described drinking a green liquid and dying from it. The connection was impossible to ignore. As the years passed, my sister completely forgot about the incident. If you asked her today, she probably wouldn't remember saying any of it. The memory belongs mostly to the rest of us, the people who stood in that bathroom and heard those words come out of a small child's mouth. Whenever I think back on it, I can still picture the scene perfectly. The bathroom floor, the worried adults, the fear surrounding the accident, and my little sister calmly talking about another life as though she were remembering an old memory. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation. Maybe there wasn't. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that everyone in that room felt the same thing when she said it. For a few brief moments, the panic of the emergency faded into the background, and all of us were left staring at a 3-year-old child who seemed to be describing the tragic end of a life she could not possibly have lived. My sister recovered completely and grew up without any unusual memories or experiences afterward. Life moved on. But every now and then, the story comes up during family gatherings. Someone mentions it, everyone laughs nervously, and then the room becomes quiet for a moment. Because regardless of what actually happened, none of us have ever forgotten the day a frightened little girl accidentally drank a green liquid and then calmly told us about another time she had done the exact same thing and died.